Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Austin Coppock, and we're going to be talking about the astrological forecast for April of 2025. Hey, Austin, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Chris. Thank you
Welcome.
for inviting. Thank you for having me.
Yes, for extending you this invitation to talk about the past and the present and the future. We're back again for another really exciting episode of the Astrology Podcast and our monthly forecast episodes. We're going to spend the first hour of this episode approximately talking about news and events that have happened over the past 4 weeks since we recorded our last forecast. Then, in the second half of this episode, we're going to jump forward to looking at the astrology of the next 4 weeks and talking about the planetary alignments in April of 2025 and making some statements and predictions about how things are going to go over the course of the next month. So as always, you can, if you want to skip the news section, just look for the timestamps either below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website to jump forward to the forecast section. Before we get started with the news segment, I wanted to do just a very quick overview of the astrology of April to give you a preview of what we're going to be talking about later in this episode. All right, so first things first, we are coming off of eclipse season still as we open this episode. We are recording this on, what is it, Monday, March 31st, 2025, starting at 12:50 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. And a solar eclipse in Aries, the second eclipse in eclipse season, just took place on the 29th. So we're actually still coming off of that energy for the entire first week of April, and there's still going to be some major beginnings and endings still as we open the month. Here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month versus how far through they'll get through the signs of the zodiac by the end of the month. Here's the planetary aspects calendar that was designed by Madeline DeCoates of honeycomb.co. And this shows some of the different aspects that go exact this month, some of the different stations, and when those aspects will peak in intensity, as well as some of the sign changes. Finally, here's our planetary alignments calendar, which shows the major ingresses and stations and lunations this month. So we open April with a big outer planet alignment, which is a Saturn-Uranus sextile, which goes exact on April 4th. Then on the 6th, Mercury finally stations direct and starts to end its 3 week long retrograde period. The same day, Venus retrogrades into and conjoins Saturn in Pisces, and then Venus, which is slowing down in the beginning of the month, eventually stations direct in Pisces itself on the 12th of April, ending its 40-day long retrograde period. The same day, there's a full moon in the sign of Libra on the 12th. Then the following week, Mercury finally departs from Pisces and moves into the sign of Aries on the 16th, returning back to the sign that it originally retrograded in back in March. The next day, Mercury conjoins Neptune at the beginning of Pisces, since Neptune recently changed signs at the end of March and moved into Aries, and that takes place on the 17th. Then on the 18th, Mars finally departs from Cancer, where it had stationed direct in February, and Mars finally moves into the sign of Leo. After that, the Sun moves into Taurus on the 19th, then it squares Mars on the 20th. We get a Sun-Pluto square on the 23rd, a Venus-Saturn conjunction on the 24th, a really tough-looking, intense Mars-Pluto opposition around the 26th, and that's going to be our most difficult aspect of the month. That's followed the next day by a new moon in Taurus on the 29th, or sorry, 27th, followed eventually by Venus departing from Pisces and returning to Aries on the very last day of the month on April 30th. So that's some of the astrology that we're going to be talking about later in this episode. But first things first, let's do some review and let's talk about some news and events that have happened since our last forecast episode. Austin, you and I talked a lot about how we expected ever since like the year ahead forecast for this to be a really big and eventful month. And I feel like it did not disappoint in terms of just the amount of different events that happened around the world and some of the weightiness of some of those events. I tried to write as many notes as I could during the course of the month, but my document became like super large in terms of trying to track everything. Were you following everything pretty closely as well this month as it was all going on?
As much as I could. I being part of the world and having my chart caught up in these was subject to some of the chaotic merry-go-round roller coaster energy. But I would check in to see if there was a sufficient degree of chaos and with a touch of lunacy, which is what I expected. And I wasn't disappointed. Wasn't disappointed. Sometimes we have an expectation and it looks like it's not going to happen. And so you're glued to it to see, whether you need to learn something because you were wrong or it just came a day later. This month did not leave me feeling very insecure, which is nice. I had enough going on. I didn't need that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to refresh people, here's the planetary alignments calendar from March. And the main things were like, Venus stationed retrograde on March 1st in Aries. We had the Virgo eclipse take place on the 14th of March. And the next day, Mercury stationed retrograde in Aries. And then just more recently, we had the Aries solar eclipse on the 29th, followed by Neptune moving into Aries on the 30th. So that's like the context of some of the news stories, and a lot of them clustered around those like three or four major alignments this month in pretty crazy and pretty striking ways. So I think we'll go through chronologically, roughly, in terms of news stories. I did want to say, obviously, we can't cover everything. I'm going to cover some of the top stories here really briefly, but I actually cut a bunch of smaller news stories out, especially ones related to like Mercury retrograde and Venus retrograde, and I put those in a separate news episode for patrons that I just released yesterday. But here we're going to hit some of the top stories, especially major geopolitical ones and international ones and things like that, as well as ones that pertain to the US, which is our primary audience. All right, so first news story chronologically was right after we recorded our last forecast episode towards the end of February. On February 28th, the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, met with President Trump in the Oval Office. And this is like right when Venus was slowing down and stationing retrograde. And it was this huge fiasco where Trump and especially Vice President Vance ended up like yelling at Zelensky and sort of ended up ambushing him where they started insulting like the way he dressed and it ended up being a low point in terms of American diplomacy and clearly a shattering, if not a fraying, if not a shattering of the alliance between the US and Ukraine, which had been so much of the focus of the past few years after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Subsequent to that, there was a suspension of military aid as well as intelligence on the part of the United States towards Ukraine. And this really reminded me how in 2023, when Venus went retrograde in Leo, there was a bunch of like celebrity breakups, and there were some tabloids that were calling that the summer of breakups or the summer of celebrity splits. But this Venus retrograde, what we were seeing with that motion where Venus retrogrades and then conjoins the sun, but then there's a wrenching motion where Venus pulls away from the sun, is we were seeing the splitting apart or the breaking up of a number of alliances, both in terms of here between the US and Ukraine, but then also elsewhere with like the US and Canada, the US and Europe, and other things like that. And that was one of the major things I really noticed that fell right at the beginning of this Venus retrograde.
Yeah, I mean that meeting was within, I believe, one day of the Venus's station on the first, and then the official cancellation of the aid, I believe, was March 3rd. So that was right on the station. And as we've talked about, certainly Venus is about relationships, which include the romantic and the friendship. But a big part of Venus for nation states is diplomacy, right? And so we have Venus stationing retrograde and in, as we say, an impatient and warlike sign. And so we kind of have the opposite of diplomacy. Instead of coming together to try to find, or the result of coming together and like smoothing over differences or finding common ground, you have a worse relationship than before the meeting, right? It's like the opposite. And there are a number of things that happened this month that I think could be considered the opposite of diplomacy, where a peace was turned into a not peace, or a situation, a truce decayed, or there was a meaningful deterioration of relationship rather than a coming together, which is very Venus standard for Venus retrogrades.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it just goes back to I think that astronomical motion where when Venus is direct and it conjoins the sun at the cazimi, they're both moving together, like in tandem, like two people that are walking in the same direction. But when Venus goes retrograde, it changes directions and conjoins the sun and it meets up with the sun. But then there's this wrenching motion where they both end up going completely separate ways. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here.
Yeah, and so if we were to describe two people doing that, we would say they slam into each other and then rip apart, which is a pretty good description of that meeting as well as a number of other things this month.
Yeah, absolutely. So the implications of that are still playing out. So we'll still see how that goes. I mean, one of the bizarre then things that relationships that it did seem to like then reignite was some sort of more positive relationship between the US and Russia. Is the other thing that a lot of the reporting was about early in the month after that meeting, because it seemed to be in some ways almost like a gift to Russia in different ways. So we'll see how that plays out. But that was one of the major things that happened at the very beginning of the month.
Yeah, and another relational change that triggered was that a lot of European nations offered much more than they had before to Ukraine to make up for the United States cessation of aid, and also began to talk very seriously about reversing a long-held policy of keeping the military budgets below X%. So there's a reversal of a very Mars ruled thing, military budgets, that was triggered by a Venus relational thing, right? So there are a
Right.
lot of implications, all very Venus retrograde in a Mars ruled sign. It's all happening in Mars's place, right? It wasn't the United States wasn't sending Ukraine bundles of flowers, right? It was military aid and assistance, right? So the gift was a Mars thing, right? And so we have a cascade of positional reversals around these Mars ruled things and in accord with Martial matters. So yeah, really, really interesting, lots of implications, very astrology.
Yeah, very astrology. Um, all right, so we'll come back to some of that with other geopolitical things soon. One of the only like I don't know, celebrity or other news stories that I'm going to mention was that the Oscars happened on March 2nd, and this is the day after the Venus retrograde station. So I already did a whole separate episode at the beginning of the month talking about this, so I'm not going to cover it in detail here, but I just wanted to reiterate some of the highlights because they were so very much tied in with the Venus retrograde and such good examples of it, as we anticipated, as we expected, because one of the things when I did a Venus retrograde episode about Venus retrograde in Aries that we anticipated is that Nick Digginvest and I found that this Venus retrograde in Aries that repeats every 8 years had coincided with the very first Oscars awards ceremony, as well as a number of important firsts and turning points in the history of the Oscars, like the first time it was televised, the first time it was on radio. So there was a bunch of firsts basically during this Oscars as well, which is one of the things that I was really impressed by from an astrological standpoint. But it was also, since it was Venus retrograde, sometimes there's snafus as well. And that indeed did happen in this one, where one of the firsts is that it was streamed live on Hulu for the first time on a streaming service. So that was one of their big firsts. But then, like 90% of the way into the streaming of the awards, I was watching it. I was streaming it through Hulu, and they were about to announce Best Actress, and then all of a sudden the stream cut out for everybody that was watching the streaming service, and you didn't end up getting to see either the Best Actress award or the final award for like Best Movie. So it was this huge kind of like debacle the first time they were doing a streaming service like that, which was pretty incredible. But later I ended up, having to go to like Twitter and other places to find out what happened or who won at the end. And it turned out that the movie Anora won Best Picture, and the lead actress in Anora, Mikey Madison, won for Best Actress. And this is also really striking as a Venus retrograde thing because It was a movie that was centered on a sex worker. And so when they all went up on stage and like accepted the awards, one of the things they did was to give a shout out to the sex worker community, which they had consulted with during the course of the film. And there'd been a history of similar things like that under this Venus retrograde in Aries in previous eras, where sometimes the movie that wins is a little like risque or like pushing boundaries or other things like that, which I think, was part of that here.
And so I haven't seen it, Nora. From what I understand, and feel free to correct me, it's quite literally a woman's harrowing journey through through the underworld, which which is the shape of the Inanna myth, which so often describes lived and narrative trajectories through Venus retrogrades.
Sure. Yeah, that was definitely part of it, like dealing with some like Russian underground sort of figures and some guys that were like bodyguards or like maybe connected with the mafia. It wasn't really clear, but yeah, there was certainly an element of that during the course of this and like her going through a journey during the course of the movie. Yeah, so it's pretty striking. And Mikey Madsen has the Sun and Jupiter, I believe, in early Aries. So Venus slowed down and stationed like right on top of those when she got the award, which was pretty incredible.
That's nice.
Um, but there was tons of other firsts as well. So the short list is, like I said, first time it was live streamed on Hulu. It was the first nomination and win for the country of Brazil. It was the first Latvian film to win an Oscar. The first time a trans actress was nominated for Best Actress. The first Black man to win the award for Best Costume, the first indigenous filmmaker from North America to be nominated for an Oscar. And then finally, for the documentary, it was the first time a Palestinian had won an Oscar for a joint documentary with an Israeli. And then with that one, I noticed later in the month, since that happened, the win happened on the Venus retrograde station. There was another event at the Kazemi halfway through the Venus retrograde cycle where the Palestinian who won the Oscar was later attacked by settlers in the West Bank and arrested, like right on the Venus Kazemi later in the month. And the Academy and 600 members ended up issuing a statement about it around that time as well. And it's still ongoing and playing out, but we'll see if anything else happens closer to the direct station of Venus in relation to that as well.
Okay. Is the person okay? Are they like, I mean,
He, it looked, I saw a video just yesterday that I think he was released. He looked like he was super beat up and like
right,
he still had blood on his clothes and stuff like that. So I don't know what kind of shape he's in because he was like
right.
limping and stuff. But
So not great, but like alive and not in captivity or something.
yeah, currently.
Okay.
So we'll see how that goes. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about the Oscars, just because I had done a broader overview of that. Other things that started happening early in the month is that uh, in relation to like Mars still recently stationing in Cancer, the economy started becoming increasingly unstable early in the month, largely due to the tariffs and the things like that that were happening with Mars and Cancer, as well as due to people kept like the news reports and the financial analysis kept also talking about just the erraticness of sometimes the tariffs were on and then all of a sudden they were taken off and then they were applied again and then they were off. And a lot of it centered around not just the tariffs, but also Trump's sort of erraticness in implementation of some of those policies, which often really invoked like his Sun Uranus conjunction, which with his Sun ruling the ascendant and just how he has that erratic, like Uranian quality. And stocks were basically just getting killed early in the month. They started to come back mid-month, but then they were down again by the end of the month, so that it ended up being the worst month for the stock market since 2022, as of the close of March on Friday. And right now, everyone's waiting for tomorrow, for April 2nd, for actually 2 days from now, where Trump supposedly has like a whole range of other tariffs that are supposed to go into place that he's calling Liberation Day. And a lot of stocks are already starting to be sold off last Friday in anticipation of that because it's anticipated that just like last month, it's going to continue to destabilize the economy and raise fears of like a recession or potentially something worse.
Yeah, and that's in addition to Trump's natal chaos signature. We expected this sort of back and forth, and and chaos is a good word, but to be more specific, it's we talked about what the planets are actually doing this month and for a good chunk of April, which is this back and forth and back and forth. And you think it's going this way, but actually it's going this way. And then there's reversing reversals that are themselves maybe subject to reversal. And that sort of unpredictability unsettles markets. It makes people very nervous about doing business. And that's different than just a bad happens and then things correct to adjust to the bad. This is a like maybe a bad happened, maybe it didn't, maybe it does, maybe I adjusted to a thing that's not happening. And it's that's the nature of the chaos, which the markets hate. And we're still in that as we are as we are podcasting now, and that continues through a lot of the next month. As we said at the end of last month, the although the calendar month ended, the period of time we were describing does not end on March 31st. It's going to take a lot of April to actually enter what looks different in the news and out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, and I was watching one like analyst talk about how he's saying like a recession is a loss of confidence in the economy and in the stock market. And that notion of like a loss of confidence in something, if that's what it takes for things to have stability or even growth, as we head into some of the chaotic, upcoming alignments, including like Uranus going into Gemini and Saturn going to Aries and some of that other stuff just sounds like not that we're not going into a period of like super stability. I don't think is something that we've been anticipating for like the next little while.
No, no. This is we did talk a lot about March, April as a chaos party to kick off the year. But it's not the it's not the yeah, it's not the only portion where they're laughing gremlins in full, clown style grease paint everywhere. There's lots of little chaos parties to come.
For sure. All right. So the next major astrological thing that happened that a bunch of stories clustered around was the first eclipse happened, which was a lunar eclipse in the sign of Virgo on the 14th. And this was actually visible across North America. So you had talked about in connection with like some of the things we saw the last year, sometimes about the fall of a leader, or sometimes in some instances last year, we saw literal assassinations of like leaders. And there was one right away, basically on the day of the eclipse, where the head of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was killed on March 14th, right on the day of the eclipse. And he was evidently killed by the Iraqi security forces in partnership with the United States. So I thought that was really striking, like right away, that was sometimes we see that on eclipses.
Yeah, well, that symbolically, in a lot of texts and systems and thinking, like the sun and the moon are the royalty of the sky because they're much bigger and brighter, and their partial or total eclipse has been connected to the destruction of leaders for a long time. Then especially this part of the eclipse cycle that we've been in for a little bit is especially assassinating. Quick question. And this, yeah. Do you know if I'm struck by, do you know if the Islamic State has a moon on its flag or heraldry?
I don't remember if they do or not.
I'm just, because it was a lunar eclipse, it makes me think of the quite famous lunar eclipse just before the decisive battle between Alexander and Darius, where Persia had a big moon on its flag, and there was a lunar eclipse the night before the battle. And then it was the decisive defeat of Persian forces by the Macedonians. Yet there shortly, like right before that, not an assassination, but also that same taking down the head. The former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, was arrested and served an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And we
Mm.
saw that type of symbolic decapitation during some of the previous instances in this eclipse cycle, where a head of state or a former head of state was internationally condemned and arrested or issued a warrant. Oh,
Okay.
and the president of Somalia, or maybe it's prime minister, I apologize if I got the title wrong, survived an assassination attempt right next to the eclipse as well, the lunar eclipse.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and later in the month, just a few days ago, near the Aries eclipse, there was these videos going around on social media about one of Putin's limos exploding near the one of his headquarters. I'm
It
having
was
trouble like verifying that this is actually legit because most major news sources aren't reporting on it, and there's some possibility that this is actually not that there's something weird about it or something not legit. So I don't want to be careful about reporting it too much, but it was striking because Zelensky just a few days earlier had surprisingly said something like that Putin would die soon, and that was already kind of like a weird headline. But then that happened like a few days later around the second eclipse.
Yeah, or there was a lot of reporting that not just a limo, but I believe it was a limo that was specifically designed for secure transportation of very important people, and it was a very expensive piece of machinery. Exploded and was on fire, and it was outside of I believe it was the FSB headquarters. Um,
I mean
that's what was reported.
that
I
is the
don't know that.
rumor.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
that's what was reported. And so that at least brings that certainly brings up the idea of assassination, whether it is falsely bringing it up or, bringing it up for some concealed purpose. I certainly don't know. But it's more assassination themed things right next to eclipses.
yeah, absolutely. So good call to you on that last month. Um, moving on,
Thank you.
also on the eclipse, on March 15th, the US began a large-scale set of strikes on the Houthis in Yemen, and this was like right after the Virgo eclipse, within 24 hours of it. So this was purportedly due to attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea that the Houthis have been carrying out over the past year or two, so much so that sh many ships had been recently having to go all the way around Africa and avoiding the Red Sea altogether due to being boarded or being shot at. So, but Trump also said that it was supposed to issue or send a message to Iran, which is one of the main supporters and backers of the Houthis. And these airstrikes are still ongoing now, 2 weeks later. One interesting like tidbit I noticed when I did the Saturn Neptune research this month, I did a whole research episode on Saturn Neptune conjunctions in history, but I found that Yemen was actually unified under the Saturn Neptune conjunction of 1989 and 1990. It used to be two like separate countries, but they got merged into one, exactly one Saturn Neptune cycle ago. So it's interesting that the country has become so prominent again under this current Saturn Neptune conjunction.
Yeah. Well, and I believe the Houthis are a separate force from the primary Yemeni government that they're trying. There's a lot of, how should we say, determination to turn that back into two countries.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. That's really relevant.
Right.
So,
The recurrence of the Saturn Neptune transit is quite meaningfully testing the unity that occurred during the last Saturn Neptune conjunction,
mm,
might be a way to put it.
good good way to put it. So, adjacent to that, one of the biggest like news stories and sort of fiascos of the month was connected to that, where as the leaders of the United States, several top-level leaders were like preparing for this strike on Yemen, on the Houthis in Yemen. they apparently had like a private chat on their phones using the Signal app, which is just a texting app. And a reporter from The Atlantic was accidentally added to the chat and ended up being privy to like their planning for this military operation, for their war planning essentially. And this is the editor of the Atlantic magazine, whose name is Jeffrey Goldberg. He was added on March 11th, just days before the eclipse, and as Mercury was slowing down to station retrograde, and he thought it was fake, basically. Like he thought he was being that is this is like somebody was playing him, or it was some foreign intelligence service that was trying to trick him or something like that, except they outlined like the exact day and time when they were going to start dropping bombs. And it wasn't until he waited until that moment and he was looking at his phone and refreshing the news on Twitter, and then he saw that bombs started being dropped on Yemen at the exact moment that this chat had said. And then all of a sudden he realized that it was legit, and he had been added to a private discussion on top level with top level leaders, including like Pete Hegseth, JD Vance, like Rubio or one of his people was there, and like basically every other top level person besides Trump who's the only major person that wasn't in the chat. And so what was interesting about this is his realization then, if that happened on March 15th, then he realized it the day that Mercury stationed retrograde. And it's such a classic like Mercury retrograde type thing where we always talk about like a miscommunication and things like that with Mercury retrograde, but on such a high level that it's going to become like top 10 like biggest times in history that Mercury went retrograde and something really goofy happened. And so he ended up publishing the story a couple weeks later, the day of the Mercury Cazimi on March 24th, or within 24 hours of the Mercury Cazimi, and ended up being just this huge debacle. And one of the things that I thought was funny is I kept seeing people use the word clowns to describe this. Like some of the phrases I wrote down was quote unquote unbelievable clowns, quote, what a bunch of clowns, and clown show. And I thought this was hilarious because Austin, you kept talking about this period in March being Clown Mageddon, or the gathering of the Juggalos. And I remember this vividly because in December, when we were preparing for the year ahead forecast, like I wasn't super on board with that. I kept wanting to like workshop like better. So surely there's a better way to describe this than like Clown Mageddon. But then I laughed like all month as people kept using the word clowns to like describe what was happening during this Mercury retrograde. And again, I have to give it to you there.
Thank you. I was getting very strong clown-based imagery. It just seemed like
I don't know how you do it. You
things
you
pop into
have
my head.
Yeah, this is your Pisces power. It's not just a way of words, but it's an intuitive sense of the sometimes like clown-like dynamics, and the ability to call it like you see it, and sometimes you see clowns.
You just gotta close your eyes, remove all of the physical sensations from your mind and hear the circus music, Chris.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's beautiful. I'm
Oh,
in
thank
awe.
you.
I'm in awe. So this is like a huge debacle, and it's like people are still talking about it. What it was made worse because of the precedent of like the Clinton email scandal from years ago, and how much Republicans had tried to blow that up into this huge thing and make it this huge thing, and then all of a sudden this makes that look like tame by comparison. And then it was actually made worse because initially, and still actually, they ended up trying to deny it. They ended up just flat out denying it, or starting to like question like the political allegiances of the reporter, which didn't make any sense because then that was even dumber if he was a Democrat or something, to add him to your group chat where you're planning a military operation. And it made it so that like if one of the things that was concerning was like if they lie about something that was a fuck up that was this obvious, then what happens if something really big happens that really requires accountability? So that was one of the broader issues. And then the other big issue that was also sometimes overlooked was that the messages in the Signal chat were set to erase instead of being kept, which is illegal because they're supposed to retain discussions like that as part of things like Freedom of Information Acts and like documentation about government things that are happening on official channels. But instead, it implied that other discussions like this are not being recorded as well. And since eclipses deal with visibility and invisibility, I
Hmm.
thought that was really relevant from an astrological standpoint because part of what was disclosed at this time is that there are some things that are being hidden and not recorded.
Right. And other things that should be hidden are leaking into the public. It's interesting that something that we talked about last month and just bears reiterating here is that the Mercury station retrograde, like the day after the big full eclipse in total lunar eclipse in Virgo, and the total lunar eclipse in Virgo has as its ruler looks to for direction that Mercury, which was in the process of stationing retrograde. And
Right.
the lunar eclipse in Virgo, when mapped onto the Sibley chart of the United States, is in the 10th house, meaning at the highest level of decision making and power, right? Causing in this case a loss of security, but a loss of like the dignity that the sun and the moon usually have, right? And then the information being released in the lead up to in the story going public, leading up to the solar eclipse, right? Diminishing the sun's light, diminishing the authority of the administration, right?
Right. Yeah, and it was also just a good example of how sometimes something that happens at the station, the next development of it happens at the Kazemi
Yeah,
with,
yeah,
you know,
perfect illustration of that.
yeah, exactly. So it's like we have that there, and then we had that with the other story with the Palestinian filmmaker who won the award on the station and then was arrested on the Kazemi. So a lot of, important things we're seeing here in terms of how some of these cycles work. So it's just such a classic Mercury retrograde thing because that's one of the problems. It's just like everyone's done that or done some version of that where you accidentally send a message to somebody or you accidentally, I haven't added somebody to a group chat accidentally, but
I,
I could
I
see that.
I've been added to group chat.
Have you? Okay.
My phone number was used to belong to somebody who was part of a very active church group in the Bay Area, and for years I would get added to group texts about like, hey, we're all gonna meet up for like the annual prayer group picnic for this. Are you coming? Can you bring this? Yeah, I'll bring the potato salad, et cetera,
Nice.
et cetera. But like, I can imagine like that, and it's people being like, oh yeah, the operation's going to commence at 2:32 military or 15:24 local time. I'd be like, oh, this is not really like some of the most powerful people in the country plotting or planning a military operation like that couldn't possibly be the
Right.
case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it was like, what was funny is like the reporter, because he's a national security reporter, he took screenshots of everything, but he ended up like leaving the chat at some point, like pretty soon after he realized that it was real and after the military operation had started. And while he released some segments in the original article of like quoting different things, he didn't release the chat messages at first. But then when they started denying it and also were denying it and denying that anything classified was said, which obviously was, it ended up, and they started attacking him. It ended up forcing him to then release the actual text messages to everybody like a few days later. So it was also an interesting thing about like sometimes like a denial of something making it worse or dragging something out more than it would have been already otherwise.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, yeah, Mercury retrograde's got jokes. Sometimes they're cruel, but Mercury
definitely.
retrograde's got jokes.
Sometimes they're embarrassing. Well, it's like that's up there now with the other like previous big one that this is dethroned as like Obama, being sworn in for the first time in 2009 under Mercury retrograde, and Roberts accidentally misspoke and didn't give him the right line. He left something out, so they ended up having to redo just out of safety, out of pure
Mm.
caution, they redid Obama taking his oath later that same day. And that was a great like Mercury retrograde, like do-overs and miscommunication type thing. But now I think this is dethroned that.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
All right. So moving on, this eclipse is crazy. Another major thing that happened on it is right after the eclipse, Israel broke the ceasefire and began bombing Gaza again on March 17th. One of the Washington Post headlines I copied from March 18th said, quote, more than 400 killed as Israel strikes Gaza, breaking ceasefire with Hamas. And, this was important because every step of the important turning points of this keep falling on eclipses, going all the way back to the original invasion of Gaza began the day of the Taurus eclipse in October of 2023. So it continues to be tied in with these eclipses as important turning points for some reason.
Yeah, sadly. Well, I guess the maybe hopeful thing is that it's the Aries Libra eclipses have since the beginning of the state of Israel always sparked periods of military hostility between them and neighbors, particularly the Palestinians. But those periods of violence usually, not every time, but usually abated by the time the eclipses move solidly into the next signs, into the Virgo Pisces. So
Uh,
I'm
well,
just
that's
saying that that's
that's
happened historically. I'm not saying I'm not promising peace. I'm just saying,
I mean, that's the problem with this one, though, falling on this is that the last Pisces eclipse, when we started this series last fall in September, fell on like the day that Israel invaded Lebanon to go after Hezbollah. So it seemed like this new eclipse series, as we were moving from Libra to Aries, was and going into Pisces Virgo, was going to start shifting to other countries like Lebanon and Yemen and Iran. But having this fall here implies that it might be continuing a whole new eclipse cycle of Pisces Virgo continuing to be about like Israel and Palestine.
yeah. So if we were going to go for that rosier historical view, the soonest that would begin would be in 6 months because half of our eclipses here, like the one towards the end or at the end of March, is in Aries. So we're not out of the Aries Libra cycle yet, right? We've got 1 foot out, but we still have 1 foot solidly in. So again, like the rose glasses version wouldn't even be valid for another 6 months from now.
Mm. Okay. Well, we will see what happens, my friend. Um, all right. So moving on, also around this eclipse on March 15th, Trump invoked wartime authority to speed up mass deportations, where he invoked the Alien Enemies Act, which was an act that was signed into law back in July of 1798. And the last time this act was used was during World War II to send Japanese people to internment camps in the US, which is, always a dark mark on like US history around from World War II. So he used this, and then immediately the next day on March 16th, after invoking this, he started sending immigrants to a private prison in Ecuador, with the first arriving on March 16th. Hey, quick correction. I noticed in editing that a couple times I said that the prison they were shipping people off to was in Ecuador, but the prison is actually in El Salvador. So I just wanted to correct that really quickly for the record. And supposedly they were sending people who were gang members, which they were supposed to be identifying through tattoos. But because there's not any due process, they're just rounding people up and then sending them to a prison in another country. One of the guys that they arrested had an autism awareness tattoo that was just like, it's just like a ribbon, like a rainbow ribbon with like his brother, I think his autistic brother's name next to it. And he was shipped off to this prison without any due process. Another one was like a gay makeup artist who had a tattoo that was like a crown and it said mom under it. And he was shipped off to this prison. And the lack of due process means that stuff like this isn't getting checked. And even non-citizens are supposed to be granted a fair hearing under the laws of the country. So already that started happening. And then already later in the month, Trump threatened that people who were burning Tesla cars could be sent to this prison in Ecuador. And Yeah, it's been a whole thing that's not good and it's kind of scary.
And Chris, what was the exact date of that?
He
Was it
invoked the act on the 15th,
okay,
I
so
believe, and then the first prisoners were already sent off March 16th.
okay. I was just
Yeah.
thinking about it in terms of obviously that's connected to the eclipse and the Mercury retrograde, but that's very much in the within the shell of the Mars in Cancer themes that we've been talking about,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
sort of might begin with protective, but often end up quite xenophobic and paranoid.
Yeah, exactly. Which was telegraphed all the way back in like September when Mars first went into Cancer, and and the tone of the election shifted suddenly to immigration, and there was a lot of like racism about Haitian immigrants and everything else. And this now is like the outcome of that as Mars is direct and retracing its steps. And yeah,
Right,
it's because
third time through the same degrees in Cancer. Third visit from Mars.
yeah. Well, and it turns out it's Mars in Cancer, but it's also Saturn, Neptune, because when I
Yeah,
did the Saturn, Neptune research this month, I ended up finding that that was also what coincided with like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is one of the first major pieces of like anti-immigration legislation in the US back in the 1800s, was Mars retrograded Cancer, but also Saturn conjunct Neptune. Um, but I actually saved the picture. I forgot that I saved it from one of the news articles. Look at this tattoo of this guy. It's a ribbon. It's like a rainbow ribbon with like puzzle pieces with his brother's name on it. And this was the supposed like gang tattoo that somehow made it okay to like strip this guy of any due process and ship him off to a prison in another country with a bunch of actual like hardened gang members. It's insane.
well, it is a pretty intimidating tattoo.
Yeah, you're intimidated by the rainbow colors, the
And
the
the
rate.
yeah, the flowing cursive script. That's in case anybody can't tell, I'm being sarcastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, um that's that's some clown shit right there. Not the tattoo, but the thinking that that indicates membership in a vicious criminal organization.
Yeah, well, it's getting very dark, and to go along with that, now they're also starting to disappear college students who are here on green cards due to their involvement in protests last year. So the US has started revoking green cards of university students and then arresting them. Um, and there's been these startling like videos of like ICE agents who are not dressed up as officers or just wearing plain clothes, like walking up and then starting to talk to and then like grabbing these people. One of them on March 8th, I wrote down, was a student named Mahmoud Khalil. And then a more recent one, which was a video that's going around that was really scary, was another Turkish, like I think PhD student called Rumeysa Ozturk on March 25th. So I mentioned these because it's another of those things where we have to pay attention to anything that's happening around eclipses, because sometimes one of the things we've learned about eclipses the past 20 years, or things I've learned about eclipses the past 2 years, is that sometimes it plants a seed of something important at the time of the eclipse that becomes much more important later on, or can become much more widespread later on. So that's one of the things I'm paying attention to right now.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of shadows of the future here.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. So those are a lot of like first eclipse ones, but a second eclipse one is we had the Aries eclipse later in the month. And within 24 hours of that, on March 28th, Vice President Vance visited Greenland. And that was one of the major stories this month, is that the US appears to be, based on their statements and based on Trump's statements, posturing and preparing as if they're going to annex Greenland some way, and that they keep saying that they're going to try to do so diplomatically, but then when pressed on it, Trump says he's not taking like military force off of the table. And one of the things you pointed out was that this solar eclipse was particularly visible over Greenland, right?
Greenland was probably the best place to see the solar eclipse. That was I'd been looking at the maps because, I went out and took a peek at the lunar because it was totally visible here. And so I was curious whether I was going to be able to see the solar, and it's almost centered on Greenland. And I saw that headline a few days ago. I was like, oh, the shadow falls on Greenland.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, and then I did a search while we were talking about this yesterday to confirm it, and then I inadvertently came back with a result saying there's going to be another eclipse in 2026 that's even more visible over Greenland next year. So that's scary because this really seems like the US like returning to being an imperialist state in a way that harkens back to like the 1800s, which we talked about before with like, for example, annexing like the Philippines or other things like that. It's probably going to break up and cause major tensions with NATO if the US actually does invade another NATO state. It's going to throw that alliance completely into disarray of what happens if another state without any good justification like invades and annexes another NATO state. It's going to validate Putin taking over Ukraine and his annexation attempt to annex Ukraine in 2022, and it's probably also going to encourage China to take over and annex Taiwan if the U.S. Just starts annexing other random countries itself. It sets a justification for any other uh, authoritarian country to do the same with other countries in their vicinity.
Yeah, and we were talking about this, and maybe I'm too cynical, but I kind of came to, I don't know, start to pay attention to world events in my 20s with 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I guess for people of my generation, there's sort of a like, well, when did the United States stop doing imperialism? Um,
I,
not that that is a justification for future actions, but it is, you know, it is interesting. It's certainly a change to see it without cover, right? Because the invasion of Iraq had justifications, many of which were proven to be lies, but there was at least the decency to try to lie about it. And so this is certainly a new phase.
yeah, I mean, there was at least I was, a lot of us knew that it was bullshit in 2003. And like I was in, I was still a teenager, but I was still like in the protest marches against the Iraq war in 2003. And then it later turned out that their justification was complete bullshit and there were no weapons of mass destruction. But there was at least the premise of some sort of justification for why they said they were going to invade Iraq. And there's none of that here. Like, there's no premise like for taking over Greenland that would justify like a military invasion at this stage. Although, yeah, they're starting to try to sell that to the American public, and it's going to be one of those things. I mean, frankly, like we saw with Ukraine over the past few years, where they're going to slow walk convincing conservatives into this being a good thing. And this was the start of that this year. And then we'll see how it's going to go over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, this a lot of this strikes me as Saturn and Aries themes, which makes sense. All these planets going through Aries right before Saturn comes to resonance in Aries should have some sort of foreshadowing effect. But historically with Saturn and Aries, it's you have might makes right, right? Rather, which is Saturn in its fallen or worst position, as opposed to Saturn in Libra, where what is fair makes right, right? Which is its exalted position. But that sort of like power is power, right? And power exists to be power rather than trying to alloy it to other principles. To me, is like classic Saturn and Aries.
Yeah, the potential of all the Saturn and Aries stuff to just in its most basic form indicate war and conflict over the next few years has becoming has become really like obvious like recently as all of this is ramping up. Like it
Yeah.
seems like we're moving into a major period of world conflict in many different areas
Oh yeah.
very rapidly all of a sudden. But yeah, okay. So that's good for that. I need to move on to the next one to keep us going through this. The biggest story this month, honestly, and the one that was the most overlooked, but is starting to become more recognized, and which I was have been focused on for months now and anticipating, was that the likelihood of a U.S. strike on Iran has been steadily increasing and intensifying all month, and that has been the main story I've been tracking because um, I both expected this to happen, but it's also been scary to see it actually start to unfold. Where, just to give a very brief synopsis of part of the sequence, at the beginning of the month, there was reporting that Trump had sent a letter to Iran with a 2 month deadline in early March, and he threatened that either they negotiate a nuclear deal or there will be military action. And what was ironic about that is Trump famously pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal agreement in 2018, which had already been negotiated by the previous administration. And something I had forgotten about, and it I was surprised to like realize and remember this month is like we were already heading towards a war with Iran during Trump's first term in 2020 when on January 3rd, 2020, he assassinated that famous prominent Iran general Soleimani on January 3rd. And that was actually right in between eclipses. It was right after
Hmm.
one eclipse and right before another. And he assassinated that Iranian general who was in Iraq for like a funeral or something. But then COVID happened and it completely interrupted everything. And then Trump was voted out of office later that year. And it sort of like averted stuff. But now that he's back in office, we have things escalating again. So he wrote that letter, giving a 2 month deadline at the beginning of March. And then all month, Trump keeps telegraphing that there would be an attack and like referring to it constantly with not very veiled language. And at first, Iran responds and says it will not be threatened, but then later in the month, they released a video. Iran released a video of these vast underground bases with missiles and missile launching trucks that were ready to go into use. And then late in the month, a bunch of B-2 stealth bombers started gathering from the US at Diego Garcia Base, which is in the Indian Ocean and is within striking distance of Iran. And there's no reason for all of those bombers to be gathering there, if not at the very least to intimidate and put pressure on Iran, but potentially in preparation for an actual strike. So then Iran sees this and they eventually respond to the letter really close to the Aries eclipse. And I think that's one of the things that happened on the Aries eclipse is that Iran responded to Trump's letter finally. Um, and then later, there's one carrier that's already in the Middle East, which is part of what's striking the Houthis. But now there's a second carrier strike group from the US that's on its way to the Middle East as well, which is going to put two carriers in the same region, which again heightens the potential for a strike. So just yesterday on March 30th, right after the eclipse, Trump said if they don't make a deal, there will be bombing, and it will be bombing the likes of which they have never seen before. So it's like stuff like statements like this where he just keeps telegraphing this attack, and the whole situation is becoming incredibly intense, and it looks like it's heading in that direction. So what's weird is that it seems to be happening a little later than I expected after the eclipse, because I thought the Aries eclipse would be the turning point, and yet it's still clearly building up and seems to be heading in that direction. So the eclipse itself may have been the bombers like constellating at that base at Diego Garcia, as well as whatever Iran's response to the letter was, because I'm not sure if it was fully clear. I think the main thing they said is that they weren't going to negotiate with Trump directly, but they would negotiate indirectly. And I don't know if part of what happens on the eclipse is that he takes that as his final provocation or justification to do whatever he's going to do. So the immediate eclipse range is still active through the first week of April, and there's some other stuff going on, but this is Yeah, one of the major things that's formulating that people are starting to notice and become aware of, but I'm more alarmed about than I think even the general public is because we've been anticipating a major exchange with Iran for a while now due to these eclipses.
Yeah, and a couple other things that support that. I remember it was before the last set of eclipses when I was thinking about Iran that I found a number of things around this time that some of which you described and some of which I'll describe shortly that raised my eyebrows. So, in addition to what you mentioned, there's also the Aries ingress chart, the chart used for predicting the events for a nation for the coming year for Iran, which came into effect on March 20th, but will be in effect all year, especially the first 3 months. Has Mars directly on the ascendant, which is, according to the older text, is an almost sure indication of war, and which was present the last time that Iran was part of a war, which was when Iraq invaded shortly after the Iranian Revolution. And then, if you look at the chart for this regime in Iran, it's about we're about the same age. It's from April 1st. And so that solar eclipse was right next to the sun in Iran's chart, which also has a sun ruled rising. It has a Leo rising, which also brings up what about when Mars goes back into Leo. And that regime chart for Iran also has Mars at 25 Pisces, where Saturn and the North Node and Venus and Mercury will all spend the whole first half of April. So yeah,
Mm.
we've been talking about this for a while, and so for me, it was a question: does it happen in March, or does it need the April part of the same period of time? Right? Because we've talked about like it's basically a 6 weeks ish period of time. We're talking about the clown Mageddon or the gathering of the juggalos, the thing, right, that we've been talking about. Like it doesn't end on March 31st, right? Minimum size would be to put it at least into the middle of April. So yeah,
Right.
yeah, I think of one mind on this, and there are a number of indicators there. And that's when you start seeing indicators wherever you look, when you use a different technique and you get indicators, and you look at cycles and you get another indicator. I will be very surprised if there isn't if there aren't overt military exchanges with Iran quite soon.
Yeah, I hope that it's averted, but I think it's heading in that direction. I just pulled up the Aries ingress for this year for Tron that you mentioned, and like you weren't exaggerating. So this is the sun, the moment that it moved into Aries was this chart, which sets up a chart for the year, and the ascendant ends up being at 20 Cancer, and Mars was at 20 Cancer when that occurred on March 20th. So you were not exaggerating.
No, dude, my eyebrows shot up about halfway, halfway up my skull. I was like, oh, really? Exact, same degree, huh? So yeah.
Right. I found something like that as well. There's a patron named Stephanie C who helped me to see this, but I always thought of the Iranian Revolution as happening in 1979, but the protests that led into it actually started in early 1978. And I looked up what was going on astrologically at that time, and listen to this. Mars was coming off of a retrograding Cancer. It stationed directing Cancer and then started moving forward again. A solar eclipse happened in Aries. Jupiter stationed direct in Gemini and then started moving through the later degrees of Gemini. So that's like three really striking and unique recurrences that were all happening
Yeah.
at the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, which is such a huge turning point for Iran as a country. And so these recurrences happening again now, because these same conditions are all happening right now in early 2025, really implies that there's an important turning point happening for Iran this year. And I really hope that I'm wrong, but it's really not looking good.
No, yeah, it's looking like quite meaningful military exchanges with consequences.
Right. And then, I had talked about how it seemed like some of the stuff that happened in March, because it was all activating Aries, would have a cascade effect over the course of the next several months and potentially over the next several years, because then Neptune would go into Aries and then Saturn would go into Aries in May. And, if a huge conflict like that breaks out, then that's part of what we're looking at, because this would not be like what happened with the US and Iraq in 2003, for example. Like this would be a much bigger, uh, more difficult and more tragic and huger than Iraq already was, but multiplied by a lot more.
Hopefully not, but yeah, it's um yeah, tremendous, very big in its implications and potentially quite awful.
Yeah. All right.
Speaking of
So
Neptune moving into Aries, I think we should report the best non-occurrence that happened with Neptune's ingress into Aries.
I don't know what that is. I have one more major news story, but I don't know
Okay,
what
well,
else you're referring to.
okay, we'll save that for the end because it's a positive thing.
Okay. So the last major news story is just this is all over the headlines today, where yesterday in an interview with a reporter, Trump said that he was quote unquote not joking about seeking a third term. And on March 30th, the New York Times had the headline, Trump says he's not joking about seeking a third term. And now today, March 31st, all the headlines are talking about this shortly after the Aries eclipse. And this is notable because this is the first time Trump has indicated that he was seriously considering the idea after other allies like Steve Bannon earlier this year in February had already started floating it and promoting it seriously at conventions and in lectures and stuff. So Trump said in the interview, quote, a lot of people want me to do it. And then he said, no, no, I'm not joking. He said, I'm not joking. He added, quote, there were methods by which you could do it. And so what he's talking about is methods to circumvent the two-term limit laid out in the Constitution. And I looked this up. It's the 22nd Amendment. It was made to the Constitution after World War II, where Republicans passed it, quote, to ensure against the overthrow of our American system of government, end quote. And the 22nd Amendment went into effect on March 1st, 1959. And get this, it was just after a lunar eclipse in Virgo had taken place and just before a Pisces eclipse had took place. And
Hmm.
Venus at the time was at 5 degrees of Aries, although it was direct. So weirdly, the first time like a president has said this since that law went into effect, the 22nd Amendment in 19 or that amendment in 1951, we have a recurrence of those placements of like eclipses starting to happen in Virgo and Pisces and Venus and Aries, which has just gone retrograde there. So unfortunately, this is the beginning of the Pisces Virgo eclipse series, as we noted recently, and that's going to last all the way through, I think, early 2027. So if this
Mhm.
is since this is the first time he said this publicly, this may be again one of those things that seem small at first, but turn out to be big in retrospect.
That's interesting. And sorry, when were those statements made? What was the day?
Um, the report, I don't know if the first headline I had was from March 30th, so that reporting may have
Yesterday.
been yesterday basically, and then all of the major media and news outlets are talking about it in headlines today on March 31st.
Okay, because I asked because I wanted to know whether it was licit to connect it to Neptune's ingress into Aries, because
Oh,
historically Neptune in Aries has coincided with a lot of fantasies of supreme solar authority. And I think we can put that very clearly in that category. And people can act on fantasies. I'm not saying that it's not a real thing because it's a fantasy, but that like, oh, I could have a third term, I could have a fourth term. I'll rule all of Europe, I'll rule all of whatever. Like these sort of these dreams of solar authority are a thing that we get with Neptune and Aries.
yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that connection, but that's actually a really good point because the thing every astrologer has been mentioning this week, not in connection with this, but just that's become the common knowledge about Neptune's ingress into Aries is that the last time that happened was the day the Civil War broke out.
Right. And
So,
that's the good news is we're right now we're a day past the ingress of Neptune into Aries, and shots have not literal attacks have not we're not actively in civil war yet
well,
as a
no, that
nation. So at least we're as long as today closes without some divide in the United States going to hot war as opposed to cold war, we're good. We're doing better than
well,
history.
no, that is not the good news. That's not my takeaway from that because the bad news is that if the day within 24 hours of Neptune going into Aries, we have a president saying that he may assume like dictatorial control, then that would create the circumstances in which if there was going to be like anything like what happened in the 1800s with the Civil War, that could potentially lead to a conflict like that. So I actually
It's
hadn't
not
thought about
great.
that, but that's not a great sign.
Well, I would just say that the at least the guns haven't started firing yet, which puts us that far ahead of the United States in 1961 or 1861. Um,
That's the I like
it
that
was
that's the
my
highest review we can get out of March was at least the guns haven't started firing yet.
right. At least we're not doing Fort Sumter yet.
Right. All right. Good times. I have a whole other international section we can either try to do really quick. I don't know what your other Neptune thing was.
No,
How are
that
you
was my
feeling? Where
Neptune.
are we
That was
at?
the good news, Chris.
Oh, that was the
I
good.
wanted to
You
end
want
on an uplifting note.
it was literally I interpreted that literally the opposite.
Not hot civil war yet.
Okay. Well, yeah. Um
You always, you know, people are always like, I'm so pessimistic, and I try to add something positive, and I
and
feel
it
like
ended
it's
up
not appreciated.
I know, I'm sorry, but
It's okay.
um
I think that's really funny that you didn't accept my silver lining of not
well, it
being
just
in an active civil war one day after Neptune's
well, no,
ingress.
because it's funny that I hadn't thought of that until you mentioned made the connection. But every other astrologer I was looking at online, now that it's become commonplace, keeps referring to the Civil War starting on that ingress. And then I didn't make the connection until you said that of like that is the major thing that happened is Trump said that within like 24 hours.
Yeah, well, at least it's not a shooting war yet.
Well, because that's the difference. But we were talking about this last month in the last forecast. That's the difference is that previous presidents under Uranus and Gemini had taken quasi-dictatorial control
Yeah, like FDR.
during
FDR is the reason that that amendment exists.
yeah, but that was during wartime. Like they were in the middle of like World War II, the Civil War, whatever, and they had a reason and a precedent
Yeah.
for it. Trump doesn't have that yet, but he's already talking about doing it, and that's the difference this time.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, we're only at 112. I bet we could do this real quick in like 10, 15 minutes if we want to quickly do our international section. Not that we
Okay.
didn't do some international stories, but
Yeah.
you know,
I'll get less chatty. We can just go through it.
okay. All right. So number one, on the Virgo eclipse, like the very same day on March 14th, a story came out about extermination camps being found in Mexico's by some of the cartels. The New York Times headline was "Extermination Camp Found in Mexico. Group Searching for the Missing Says," and it was discovery of the horrifying extent of cartel violence, where searchers uncovered a site with a bunch of like bones where there had been a crematoria of burnt human remains and numerous personal belongings. So this caused an outcry and outrage and calls for government action and highlighted the ongoing crisis of disappearances and the brutal reality of organized crime in Mexico.
Yeah, there are, when I was researching this, there are, I believe, about 120,000 missing persons that are unaccounted for right now. And the most striking photographs of the site involved piles of shoes,
Right. And that,
em
which ironically, that was like part
empty
of the
shoes.
that was part of the controversy around that Oscar nominated movie that a lot of people from
Right,
Mexico were not happy about is the almost like trivialization of that in the movie.
right. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
of Emilio Perez. That was the movie. So the next story you had.
Oh, I was just looking at what happened around the eclipses, and so during also right around our lunar eclipse, there was a shockingly lethal nightclub fire in Macedonia that injured hundreds of people and killed several dozen. And later, not only was that a tragedy right on the eclipse as in and of itself, but it also sparked a big series of protests later in the month, which was a thing that happened in a lot, several European nations and in Turkey and a couple others. There were very large street protests.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that was. Oh, and also on the lunar eclipse, in the American Midwest, there were record. It was I was going to say record breaking. There was a record tying number of tornadoes. I believe there were 115 or so tornadoes that also killed dozens and injured hundreds. Right on the sort of starting on the 15th and running through the 16th. So leading into the eclipse, active during the night of the eclipse, and then the day after.
Wow. Yeah. That's big. This one is more of a Mercury retrograde one, but on March 20th in London, in the UK, Heathrow Airport, like a energy thing connected with it caught fire. It shut down Heathrow Airport, and just like hundreds of flights from around the world, because Heathrow is such a big hub, were turned around. And I saw this amazing video on Twitter of this person that was on a flight from Dallas to London, and they were like halfway there. They were passing over like New York and Toronto on the map, but then they had to turn around and go all the way back to Dallas. And I've never seen a great illustration of Mercury retrograde than that image of like getting halfway there and having to go all the way back.
Right, like the flight path looks like Mercury through the zodiac.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to do this one?
Oh, okay. Around the same time, there were also massive anti-corruption protests in Serbia by students. The protests started in November after a tragedy drew attention to government corruption and triggered demands for accountability. It was primarily in Belgrade. It was triggered by allegations of electoral fraud and governmental corruption. People took to the streets demanding a rerun of recent elections and an investigation into claims of manipulation. And the demonstrations were marked by clashes with police, arrests, escalating tensions. It highlighted a growing divide between the youth and the government, with an emphasis on demands for transparency and accountability. And at the same time, we also have those Macedonian protests. We also have protests in Romania, and then we also have big protests in Turkey.
Yeah. Huge protests broke out in Turkey on March 19th. So after the first eclipse happened on the 14th, this is following the arrest and detention of the mayor of Istanbul, and plus more than 100 other opposition members and authorities. So that was another like huge one. With the Serbia protests, there was this crazy video of them using what seemed like a sound cannon or something. Did you see that? Like, and shooting it into the protests of students, and then all of them like spread out like immediately because it was
No,
hitting them, I guess, if that was
I,
real.
I've heard of those weapons being developed and being intended for use for that kind of anti-protest, like breaking up groups of people, but I didn't see that they had been deployed that way. That's some Pluto and Aquarius shit, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, for sure.
the sci-fi weapons getting the energy weapons being deployed against the crowd.
Yeah, to like exert power and control
Hmm.
over the masses, uses of technology. So yeah, the Turkey protests were big. Elsewhere, Justin Trudeau stepped down, and the new Prime Minister of Canada stepped in. Mark Carney assumed office on March 14th, literally the day of the eclipse. And he gave a speech, this Venus retrograde speech, where he said that Canada's old relationship with the United States was essentially over. He said that the old relationship, quote, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. And again, this gave me like huge Venus retrograde breakup vibes
Right.
of, if 2023 was the summer of celebrity breakups, then 2025 was the year, the Venus retrograde of country alliance breakups. Elsewhere, very close to the Aries eclipse, there was this major earthquake in Myanmar that caused widespread devastation. It was a 7.7 earthquake on March 28th, so very close to the Aries eclipse. So far, the death toll is topped over 2,000, but they're still searching for survivors at this point. And there's a civil war in the country that's complicating the earthquake relief efforts at this point. Some of the videos that came out of that earthquake were just insane in terms of there was one high-rise building that was under construction that started swaying and
Oh,
then collapsed. There were others where there were like these pools on top of skyscrapers, and the water started falling out of the pools down the side of the skyscrapers. And there was even one security video of like this couple that was like lying on a floating raft in this infinity pool, and then all of a sudden the pool starts shaking and the water starts going over the edge of the building, and they just jump out barely in time. So that was really striking seeing that earthquake so close to that eclipse.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, eclipses fuck shit up. And as further testimony to that, towards the very end of the month, South Korea had one of its worst wildfires in history with over 87,000 hectares of land being destroyed and killing dozens of people.
Incredible. All right, so that's it for the news. I cut a bunch of other news stories out of this that were like more minor stories or ones that were in pop culture or other things like that. I recorded those with Lisa Scheim as an episode of the Secret Astrology podcast yesterday. It's like an hour and a half long. So if people want even more news from stuff that happened this month, they can check that out through my page on patreon.com. But otherwise, I think that's good for the news section. And why don't we take a little break? I wanted to give it a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. So the in-person conference is sold out. However, they do still have tickets available for their live virtual conference, which is going to stream simultaneously online for anybody signed up for it. So there's going to be 35 different speakers giving lectures with tons of lectures and workshops happening all week. There's going to be some big pre and post conference workshops with different astrologers, including a number that have appeared on the podcast, such as Lisa Scheim, who's given a lecture or workshop on zodiac releasing, Demetra George, Jason Hawley, Anne Orderly, Kira Sutherland, Nina Griffin, Judith Hill, and Gemini Brett, all giving workshops. There's also a special online only guest workshop by Richard Tarnas. So that one is not available for people that are attending in person, but if you sign up for the online one, you can get access to that workshop, which is a pretty cool exclusive. So you can sign up for the full conference, or you can just sign up for individual days or workshops if you want. But full registration does give you 2 weeks of access to watch the recordings afterwards, just in case you don't get to catch every lecture you want to see live. And then it also gives you discounts on workshops and recording bundles after that 2 week access period is over. So they've really expanded some of the live stream options for virtual attendees this year, and they're going to do live speaker Q&A sessions throughout the main conference so that you can ask questions to some of the speakers directly for virtual attendees after the lectures are over. Plus, they're going to do a Saturday night ascendant sign masquerade ball. They're also going to do each evening a virtual dinner and drinks with after hours hangouts. And then finally, they're going to wrap up the weekend with a Sunday night virtual after party and final celebration. So you can find out more information or you can get tickets at norwac.net. And I really appreciate that they keep expanding. It's 5 years. It's 5 years now since COVID happened. And I remember that first NORWAC after COVID, where they suddenly had to like switch to an online conference within a month after everything closed down. And I really appreciate that they've continued to expand their online and live streaming options for those of us who can't go there and be there in person. For me, for health reasons, but also for other people maybe that can't afford to travel or what have you. So it's one of the positive things I really appreciate about what NORWAC is doing here.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of great things about that hybrid model.
Yeah,
And Norwac's,
absolutely.
I mean, this will be the 500th time we've talked about how NORWAC is such a nice thing, but it really is both online and in person. It's a conference both you and I have spoken at and then also attended as audience members, dozen plus times. It's wonderful that it's one of the few conferences that reliably happens every year and reliably just brings a pile of great astrologers with a wide variety of expertise. It's
Yeah,
cliche to say there's something for everyone, but there usually actually is.
yeah, no, they do. The organizers do a really good job of picking out a wide variety of diverse lectures and lecturers. That way, when you go to a conference, one of the benefits from an educational standpoint is you get this wide cross section of like what's going on in the community with different leaders giving presentations on their own style of astrology. And there's something really beneficial from that from an astrological standpoint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it remains an amazing conference.
Absolutely. So people can get more information or sign up at norwac.net. There's also another conference that's taking place actually before NORWAC this month. It's a local conference in Los Angeles, and our other sponsor is the LA Astro Fest. So, with this conference, the Art of the Zodiac presents the first annual LA Astro Conference, which is happening in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Highland Park the weekend of April 25th through the 27th. LA Astro Fest welcomes everyone from the astro curious to the professional astrologer. The weekend kicks off with a Friday night party showcasing an astro-themed set by the band Freak Nature Puppets, a performance from the alt comedy troupe Planets, 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 and a light panel discussion exploring the intersection of astrology and entertainment. Then on Saturday and Sunday, they feature morning workshops from astrologers Diana Rose Harper and Samuel F. Reynolds, followed by talks from such exciting contemporary astrological voices as Clarissa Dolphin and Jonah Emerson Bell. If you're not in LA, tickets are available to stream Sam and Diana's workshops from anywhere in the world. So you can secure your spot today by visiting laastrofest.com. And if you use the promo code Brennan10 for a 10% discount on tickets. So space is limited and tickets are selling out fast. So sign up today if you want to join. So yeah, shout out to LA Astrofest for sponsoring this episode in addition to NORWAC.
Yeah, and shout out to Sam and Diana, who've been our third chair multiple times and who we've both known for a while, and I think can and whose work we can both stand behind.
Yeah, and that's why when I heard of this, anything being headlined by like Sam and Diane, I definitely want to promote and endorse because I know they do quality work, as we've seen many times when they've been here on the podcast before. All right, I want to transition to talking now about the astrology of April and getting into our deep dive into the astrology of the next 4 weeks. So, I want to start by giving a little bit of synopsis of the month and some context for what we're coming into the opening of April with. So, of course, April opens with us coming in fresh off of the eclipse in Aries, and we're still in eclipse season through the first week of April, all the way until at least the 5th, which is approximately a week after the Aries eclipse. That eclipse is still going to be very active and very potent in terms of its associations with major beginnings and major endings in people's lives, as well as world events. We also have the context, as we were just talking about, of Neptune having just moved into Aries. And so we're still experiencing the very first days of that and getting accustomed to that energy, but also needing to pay attention to what kind of world events happen, because that may be a preview of some of the stuff that's going to become important over the course of the next decade that Neptune's transiting through that sign. So early on in the month, Mercury and Venus are wrapping up their retrograde cycles, and they eventually station by the second week of April, both in Pisces, conjoining Saturn in the North Node. Then mid-month, Mars finally departs from Cancer and moves into the sign of Leo, where it immediately begins building up to its third and final opposition with Pluto, which is our tensest and most difficult aspect of the month, which kind of casts a shadow over the second and especially the later part of the month before that aspect goes exact on March 26th. So those are some of the primary things happening this month, just to give you some orientation where somehow we're going, what's the phrase, like out of the pan and into the fire in terms of like going out of this like crazy eclipse season. And then you get like a little bit of relief with the two planets stationing direct, which is somewhat positive in the second week. But then right away, we start getting this very tense aspect later in the month of Mars opposite Pluto.
Yeah, out of the fire and into the frying pan.
Yeah,
Or maybe
something,
it's
there's
out of the
some,
frying pan and into the fire. But yeah,
okay.
both are really hot.
Yeah, that's the thing is like you would think we're getting a break here, but there's this tense energy. And it's like we talked about this opposition many times in the past because it was tied in with this whole Mars retrograde cycle that's been happening since last fall. But so this is going to be the third and final hit, and that's important because sometimes the third hit can be the most important when there's three exact hits of an aspect. So even though we've talked about this aspect so much over the past like 6 months, so it feels like it's almost overdone, it might be worth re-emphasizing again here, um, which is like we had this Mars Pluto opposition right before the US presidential election in early November. That was the first time it went exact.
And
Then,
right before, like a day and a half before, right? It
yeah,
wasn't like leading up to it, it was like right before.
yeah, and then we had it the second pass of Mars opposite Pluto was at the beginning of January, and that's when the new US Congress was sworn in. And we also had those three, at least three really bizarre, sort of like violent type events where one of them was that on New Year's Day, there was a Tesla car that was blown up in front of Trump Hotel in Vegas in like a suicide slash terrorist attack. The other was that there was this guy in New Orleans who drove into a crowd of people on New Year's Eve in this really bloody and violent, also sort of like quasi-terrorist attack. And then we also had the LA fire. There may have been a smaller fire that was started by fireworks around Los Angeles on New Year's Eve. And then one of the early reporting, I'm not sure if this is still the case or what the final verdict was, but some of the early reporting was saying that that fire started on New Year's Eve on the Mars Pluto opposition, may have been smoldering and then eventually been reignited later, like a week later, that eventually turned into the huge LA fires that swept through during the course of that. So that's kind of our precedent, in addition to, over the past few years, other Mars Pluto precedents where oftentimes it's like a really tense or sometimes violent act takes place, but Pluto, which is Mars, but then Pluto amplifies it and takes things way too far, is sometimes some of the energy with that.
Yeah. Yeah, there there's you get, yeah, you get an over intensification, or Mars without limits, or a martial or violent act without limits. You have, there's a historical association between Mars Pluto and what get classed as terrorist events, where and that's part of it, is there's often a sort of like the difference between like Mars doing a war, where there may be violence and deaths, but it's for a strategic objective. A lot of times, the events that cluster around Mars Pluto fall into the category of what we would call senseless violence, right? Like, which often means more civilian casualties, or an act of violence that doesn't seem to have a clear objective in mind, or doesn't seem to have anything to do with accomplishing something. That
Right.
senselessness is very often part of the Mars Pluto dynamic.
Or if there is an objective, the objective is like the annihilation of something, like not just
Right.
doing violence to something, but to like completely wiping something out was one of the other like themes that we were seeing with Mars Pluto hard aspect.
Yeah, yeah, that the like the language of like the thought processes of a not instead of not victory but annihilation.
Yeah. So here's the planetary alignments calendar again for those watching the video version. Here's the Mars Pluto opposition later in the month that we're already jumping towards talking about because it looms so large later in the month, especially once Mars goes into Leo on the 18th. But maybe I should back it up. Let's back it up. Let's take it back to the beginning of the month to get things more chronological again. And um, I want to stress and emphasize because one of the things we're recording this today, the very last day of the month on March 31st, because the eclipse was happening at the end of the month, the Aries eclipse, and we knew there was going to be major events happening around that eclipse. So we wanted to push this forecast as late as we possibly could so we could see what those events would be. But unfortunately, due to the constraints of it being the end of the month, we couldn't wait any longer. But the eclipse season is still in effect, as I was saying. And here's the eclipse graphic that Madeline Decotes from honeycomb.co made me for this one. And we see putting it on a graph how eclipse season, we entered into it on the 7th of March, which is a week before the first eclipse, which peaked on March 14th. And the graph peaks, and then there's a little decline, but you get in the middle of eclipse season for most of the middle and later parts of March. And then it peaks again on March 29th, but then we're still coming down off of that eclipse slope all the way until a week after that eclipse, which takes us all the way until at least March or until April 5th. So that's part of the energy of that somewhat chaotic eclipse energy, but also that energy of there being like major endings and major beginnings happening in people's lives is still very prominent and very potent for the first week of April.
Yeah, and it's not just that we're still well within the eclipse's shadow at the beginning of April. Venus is still retrograde. Mercury is still retrograde. It's really that trio of factors that played the circus music throughout March and created the chaos and instability. And so all of that is very much still in effect. And as far as how long does the shadow of the eclipse extend, I think 1 week past the eclipse is a good position. I think you can also argue that you need a normal lunation. You need to get
Hmm.
back to a normal new moon or full moon to like get back into the normal flow of time, which would give it 2 weeks. And at
Right.
least in this case, we're going to kind of need those 2 weeks to get out of this, as we say, this set of questions before the Mars Pluto kicks in, because we need the first half of the month for Mercury to go direct and for Venus to go direct and to get us out of the eclipses. In many ways, it would be really useful to think of March as extending, I don't know, halfway into April, because it's
Hmm.
kind of same. One of the
Yeah, absolutely.
differences, I'm glad you agree. One of the one of the differences in early April from March is that even though they are still direct, we're able to see visibly Mercury and Venus a little tiny bit. They become visible just before the sun rises, and so
Hmm.
this is a reappearance after after a sort of double obscuration, right? They're obscured by the sun's light, and the sun's light itself was obscured by the eclipse, which is kind of a weird optical haiku. Um, but and but as they reappear, which is from a observed astrology perspective, it's like, oh, they've been missing. Where's Venus? Where's Venus? Where's Venus? And then we see Venus again. We see Mercury again after this period of invisibility. But they emerge right next to Saturn. They emerge like very like you'll be able to see it if you get up before dawn. Tell me about it. I won't be up that early. And then quite invisibly, the North Node or the head of the dragon, one of the eclipse points is right on Saturn and right on Mercury and right on Venus. And so this reemergence heralding a new cycle has this hard hard Saturnian quality to it. It's not Venus reemerging in Pisces and getting ready to station direct. It's that, but right next to this sort of these sort of cold, hard truths and situations that Saturn represents that themselves are under the discomforting shadow of the head of the dragon.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like Venus and Mercury are both emerging from their underworld journey that was, especially they reached the middle of at the Cazimis in late March when they conjoined the sun. And now they reemerge in the other side back in Pisces, retreading and returning back to an area that they were at earlier this year. And so for many people, they're going to be revisiting some period from the past couple of months, starting in January when Venus first moved into Pisces, and having to revisit something that they thought was finished. But when those two planets reemerge, they're conjoining Saturn. And I feel like Venus is doing better of the two planets in terms of the reemergence, because Venus is at least exalted in Pisces when it stations direct in the second week of April while conjoining Saturn, whereas Mercury is not doing as well because it's in Pisces, which is the sign of its fall or depression, where Mercury struggles a little bit with its primary function, which is like to communicate things clearly. And when you have it conjoining Saturn at the same time, sometimes that can inhibit communication or make it harder to communicate for some reason, even though it's stationing direct and attempting to resume its communicative functions again. With Venus being exalted and conjunct Saturn, Venus is like re-emerging in her throne. So she's exalted, and it almost like represents a woman or a femme type figure who's in a position of power or a position of being raised up societally to a prominent point of visibility. But she's still struggling with some Saturnian issues, which can be issues pertaining to like time, to health, or even potentially to things like appearance or other things like that, while starting to move forward again.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point about the deeply contrasting essential dignity situations of Venus and Mercury, because both of them come back into the world to find that it's a hard situation, right? You imagine, you're digging your way or you're climbing your way out of the underworld. You're like, all right, I'm gonna get back to the normal world, and you get there, and it's kind of frozen over and depressing, and there's a bunch of weird emails in your inbox, right? But Venus emerges back like basically at the height of her power, right? Doesn't mean that the problems are any less, but Venus is almost maximally capable of trying to either take them on and solve them or rise above them. It's worth noting that Venus crosses the single degree of greatest exaltation during this period and stations very close to that maximum degree of exaltation, whereas Mercury is in the opposite situation, like fallen, hungover, confused, and so is at a weak point and and therefore has a much hard will likely have a much harder time with the same challenges. Just like, if you imagine yourself on your same challenge but on your best day, and then same challenge, same problem but on your worst day. And just from a simple like practical perspective, yeah, Mercury's in wretched condition, and so mercurial things, especially if it aspects your chart meaningfully, may be extra difficult. I got a big dose of that over the last 2 days, just as Mercury re-entered Pisces and trined my rising perfectly.
Yeah, well, it retrograded back and hit Neptune, which is something I was seeing with both of them is when retrograding back, they were immediately conjoining Neptune in the final degrees of Pisces before Neptune had changed signs. That day when Venus retrograded back and conjoined Neptune, OpenAI or one of the AI companies must have released some new thing where you could take an image and then tell it to redo the image in the style of some famous animation style. And people all over Twitter and elsewhere were posting like famous images that had been turned into Studio Ghibli like animation style, anime style, which on the one hand was an interesting manifestation of like this bursting forth of like a artwork all of a sudden being reimagined all across the internet of famous pieces. But on the downside, it was also like ripping off the style of like this famous animation company from Japan, which is probably not super thrilled to see their work used in that way.
Yeah, it's Neptune, right? It's like, is it a benefic? No. Is it a malefic? No. It's complicated and maybe not resolvable.
Right. It's blah. Um, I was surprised at, especially early in the retrograde. I don't know that I should have been surprised, but it was an interesting learning thing for me when Venus stationed retrograde in Aries early in March, how much like topics surrounding women seemed to be not going well for different stories I was seeing in the news related to women. Like on the same day, the day that that Venus stationed at the beginning of the month, I saw these two separate instances online of women streamers who were like attacked basically, like on the day of the Venus retrograde station. There was
Wow.
one. There was one where there were these two streamers that were going around streaming, and then this like guy comes up to them and um, starts saying stuff to them and he asks them out. And then one of the streamers like turns them down and they keep walking. But then he started following and like stalking them. And eventually, at one point in the live stream that thousands of people are watching, he lunges at them and says he's going to kill them. And it was a really dark, like, instance of some of those classic Venus themes and things that like women have to deal with of like men like not taking rejection well or violence on the part of men or things like that. And then the same exact day, there was another streamer that I saw that it went viral on different social places where there's a streamer named Amarath who had previously posted a screenshot of her crypto holdings months ago, which were a lot. And then three guys showed up at her house with guns and forced her like into her house at gunpoint and beat her up and tried to force her to transfer her crypto to them outside. And she ended up leading them to the other side of the house where her husband was in another room and he pulled out a gun and started shooting at these guys and shot one of them and ran off. But she was like live tweeting some of it as it was happening, asking for help. So it was this huge, weird debacle. And at first, people were questioning why she was like live tweeting. Um, and it sounded fake or something like that. But then she posted the security camera footage, and you see these three guys with guns like dragging her into her house and then hitting her, and then eventually running off when they start getting shot at. And that happened on the Venus station. So that was a story I was going to cut from this, but I just wanted to mention it because I was surprised of that and other stories with the Venus retrograde where sometimes negative themes involving women and in that instance, like things like violence and other things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. The Venus retrogrades, especially with the ruled by the Mars, and the Mars in Cancer brings out, it being Mars's fall. It often brings out the worst in the Mars. Many of whom embodying the Mars are men, particularly young men.
Right. So now that we're coming out the other side of that with Venus stationing direct conjunct Saturn, but exalted in Pisces, I feel like especially around this lunation, the first lunation of the month, which happens to be a full moon in the sign of Libra that's ruled by Venus, and we get Venus stationing direct. I'm hoping that there's some more positive stories involving women because usually, this is one of our more positive indications this month, all other things aside, is Mercury and Venus emerging from the underworld and starting to move forward again. And so therefore potentially like some themes involving women like moving forward again, or especially prominent women taking a stand about something or being in a better position than they were when we went into this retrograde like 40 days ago.
Yeah, I mean, Venus emerges from a retrograde, as and the Venusian part of our lives and selves. It's, you've kind of been through all of the questions, all of the fears and arguments, and there's a way to move forward, even if it's not maybe what you wished for. It's not necessarily the ideal circumstance, but there's there's a clarity of purpose, And that clarity of purpose, which we always get at the end of a Venus retrograde, is in many ways like redoubled by the fact that Venus stations direct in such a good position for Venus.
Mm.
Um, and it is striking, as you point out, that we have our first lunation of the month, which is a full moon that will not turn blood red, but will instead stay
Right.
lunar silver the entire night. Basically at exactly the same time that Venus is stationing direct, and that is in and of its is that full moon itself is also Venus ruled, and yet both the sun and the moon in this chart are T squared or squared aspected very strongly by our old friend Mars in Cancer, right?
Right. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Who is there to take rejection badly and follow you
Right.
home.
Um, I like what you're saying with the
Or just
clarity
sorry,
of
go ahead.
purpose. I like what you're saying with the clarity of purpose, and because that's very positive, just with the direct station following or falling on the full moon, just that for some people, it will be a period of like clarity of purpose. Because Venus retrograde so often, as you were saying, brings up things about like either old relationships or current relationships or whatever house Venus is retrograding in for you, you wanting to do a makeover or like rethinking some of the topics in that house. And sometimes that 40-day period can be very confusing because you can have a lot of conflicting emotions as you're like thinking about the past and the present and the future, and you're deciding where you want to go in the future and maybe taking a change of course or a course of change of direction. But then by the time it stations, usually you start having a clarity of purpose about how you want to move forward again and the future that you actually do want to manifest. And aside from the tenseness of that full moon, which we'll get into, I think that's one of our most positive things this month is just having a clarity of purpose and a forward direction again in the second week of April.
Yeah, because even if something is quite difficult, if you just have a straight line, we're like, well, this is what there is to do. Then you can focus your energy on navigating that terrain. Whereas when you're not sure if that's even the right direction, even small difficulties or setbacks will kind of will be magnified because you're like, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't do this at all, et cetera, et cetera. Like purpose and clarity again, and a clarity of trajectory is an immensely powerful and useful thing. We're much more effective when we know what we're doing, even if we don't love that that's what there is to do.
Right. Absolutely. So, I think this would be a good time to highlight my best election of the month, which is actually early in the month, because in terms of like auspicious dates, and if you're trying to do things during a good period of the month rather than a more challenging period of the month. When I looked through, and Lisa Scheim and I picked out the auspicious electional charts for our electional astrology podcast for patrons this month, we couldn't get around how tense that Mars Pluto opposition looks that starts building in the second half of the month. And as a result of that, I think it's a really good idea to try to get some of your more important stuff in early in the month rather than later in the month if you can, as long as you can, to avoid that Mars Pluto opposition. So as a result of this, my best electional date for April is actually on April 2nd, 2025, around like let's say 2:40 p.m. local time in whatever your city is. So part of the good point about this election is that we're taking advantage of this auspicious looking Jupiter moon conjunction that's taking place that day. And in our location, the moon will be around 14 degrees of Gemini, applying to a conjunction with Jupiter around 16 degrees of Gemini. The rising sign for your location, you should set it to about the middle of Leo. And if you do that, then the sun will be the ruler of the ascendant, and it'll be placed up in the ninth house where it's exalted in the sign of Aries. And it's applying to a nice little sextile with Jupiter, which is actually one of our most positive aspects this month, is that Sun sextile with Jupiter that happens around the fourth and around the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth that goes exact during that few day time range. And that's really one of the primary things that this election is set to take advantage of, in addition to the Moon Jupiter conjunction. So it's a decent chart for especially 11th house matters because you have that Moon Jupiter conjunction in the 11th house of friends and alliances and groups, and it would be helpful for some of those things. It also has some focus on ninth house activities due to the sun's placement there, which can be about education, sometimes travel, beliefs, or other things like that. So this is my best electional chart of the month that I'd recommend. We are still pretty close to eclipse season. We're still coming out of eclipse season. So some of the rockiness of that, the tempestuousness of that is still relevant at this time, but I feel like that's more optimal than trying to squeeze something in later in the month when the Mars-Pluto opposition becomes much more prominent. So that's one of that's the best electional chart this month. We found other electional charts as well, which you can get access to if you listen to our electional astrology podcast, which is available through my page on patreon.com. We have a bunch of other elections throughout the month. If you need to do things during even the more unoptimal times, like around the time of the Mars-Pluto opposition, we have some elections to at least try to mitigate that as much as possible. So you can find that or find out more information at patreon.com/astrology podcast. All right. So that's
Not
the
an
best.
easy, yeah, it's not an easy month. But even within, yeah, less than ideal periods of times, there are much better and much worse times to initiate things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to highlight that because that's one of my more positive aspects of the month is not just that Moon Jupiter conjunction, but the Sun Jupiter sextile that's going exact around April 5th and April 6th, where we can see the Sun hitting about 16 degrees of Aries and then sextiling Jupiter. And even though sextile is not usually like, huge aspect to write home about, part of the reason why it's actually positive and you want to try to squeeze in some things while the Sun is still applying to that is because once the Sun completes that sextile with Jupiter. Unfortunately, it's like heading into a square with Mars for most of the rest of the month, which actually starts getting very close and eventually completes around April 20th, I believe, once Mars has moved into Leo and the Sun has moved into Taurus. So the Sun goes from like a really nice condition with that sextile to Jupiter to something not as nice once it starts squaring Mars and squaring Pluto around the time of that opposition between Mars and Pluto.
Yeah.
So let's bring things to that full moon. Why
Well,
don't
well, let's,
we?
we should mention, yeah, just to be clear, just to do it chronologically, because we did talk about it a little bit, right?
Mm,
So at the end of basically the first full week of April, we get Mercury's direct station.
right.
Right. And then our next sort of major tonal change. So 6th, 7th for Mercury's direct station. And then about 5 days later, so the next week, we have the near simultaneous direct station of Venus and the occurrence of the full moon. And so that I think that's a really meaningful boundary because that's for sure the end of the eclipse shadow because we see the moon go unshadowed that night. It's the end of Mercury in direct motion. That was the week before, and Venus is no longer retrograde either. And so, like there are consequences and things to work out still, but Mercury and Venus are visible. No more eclipse shadow. It's the next period of time where with the 12th we get to the next phase, and March is finally over on the 12th.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we move into the next phase of things once we hit this new lunation. And I was trying to, when you and I, during our planning session this weekend, I was trying to identify like what are the positive things happening this month. And one of the things we came to that you said was part of the most positive things this month are just the removal of some of the challenging things from last month, which is primarily these two stations of Venus and Mercury in the second week of April, which really culminates, especially on this full moon in Libra.
Yeah. Oh, and right, getting normal full moons rather than like blood-soaked moons. And although I don't think you're wrong at all to underscore the scariness of the Mars Pluto opposition. one what we do get with Mars moving into Leo to oppose Pluto, which we don't like, but it also means Mars is not in Cancer anymore, and we have. There have been dozens of things which were very clearly a result of Mars being in Cancer over the last several months, which I don't think anyone will miss, right? The first major one being the LA fires, which started within a day of got big within a day of Mars retrograding into Cancer. Onto and including a number of these American domestic policies, which are less than ideal, et cetera, et cetera. Like, although we may not welcome Mars opposing Pluto and Leo, we shall not miss Mars. We will not. We will remember it, but we will not miss Mars in Cancer. It's caused a lot of trouble.
Yeah, it's been rough. The literalness of like some of the manifestations has been startling. Like ever since as soon as it went in September, like how clear it was and what a unique and different vibe it has been that has been largely not super welcome with the retrograde and the intensity of that. I feel like we get one final like extinction burst of that with this full moon though, because the full moon
Oh yeah,
goes
that's great way to frame it.
it goes exact at 23 degrees of Libra, and then immediately once the full moon goes exact, it then applies to a square with Mars, which is at 27 degrees of Cancer here. So it's like, while the Mars station directing Cancer in February was certainly a very, very intense and important turning point, I think Mars is going to have some final parting words and parting shots as it's making its way out of Cancer around the middle of April. And it would definitely be worth it for everybody to sort of pay attention to what house that's transiting in your chart and what sort of events have been coming up ever since September of last year when Mars first moved into Cancer, and how some of that's starting to wind down now, and how there might be like a final push to get Mars out of that sector of the zodiac and out of that sector of your chart.
Yeah, nice framing, Chris. And it's funny because we discussed this full moon in terms of Venus, because Venus is stationing direct. Venus is like, okay, I've been through a lot, but I figured it out. It's not going to be easy, but I know what to do. And then the full moon is like, hey, I'm Venus ruled. Let's do that. And Mars is like throwing itself a big red going away party in the middle of what should be Venus's moment.
Yeah. One thing that might be helping us with it is I wasn't sure how to articulate this, but I did write it down as one of the more positive aspects of the month, which is um, this where Uranus is at like 25 degrees of Taurus, and how one of our first aspects at the beginning of the month is Saturn sextiling Uranus from 25 Pisces to 25 Taurus. And some of the Pisces stuff then is forming trines with Mars, some flowing aspects with Mars. So it's like part of my hope with that is there could be some constructive ways the planets in Pisces are um, pushing Mars out of Cancer, but also restraining or trying to make that a smoother transition than it might be otherwise as a result of those flowing aspects. How would you articulate like a Saturn Uranus sextile, or what keywords might we give to that, which could be prominent at the beginning of the month where that aspect is going exact?
Yeah, thanks for picking that out because they're slow moving planets. It's background. It's the first in a series that will be occurring throughout this year. The other sextiles will take place in a different pair of signs, but it's the same relationship. We've begun with this. We enter into the Saturn Uranus sextiles. So Saturn and Uranus are hard planets to get to work together. In my experience, um, their natures are inherently opposed. Uranus wants to play an entirely new game, whereas Saturn wants to finish the existing game. Right? Saturn looks to the past and looks to solidify things. Uranus looks to the future and looks for things that haven't been tried before. And so it's difficult to get them. One is experiment, one is go with the tried and true. And so it's difficult to get them to work together. The sextile might be the perfect relationship for synergy, for what possible synergies there are, because they're not forced into the same car. They're not forced to like do an awkward buddy cop movie where like it's a conjunction. They have they're in a sextile relationship. The interests of experimentation and for Uranus and of moving more traditionally and carefully with Saturn, they're aligned. Like there's something Saturn benefits or can potentially benefit from Uranus experimenting over there, and Uranus can benefit from Saturn holding it down over there. So it's as far as their relationships go, like again, the traditional, the non-traditional, the experimental, the tried and the true. It's a good, it's as good as it gets because they're not too much in each other's shit, but they're in position to assist one another.
Absolutely. I'm glad you used that term like synergy because I think this is like when there's a lightly synergistic relationship between the forces of the old and the forces of the new, and a way to integrate those two usually competing um, impulses in your life that either want to keep doing the same thing and bring you back to the past, or those forces that want to throw you light years into the future, and having not a full synergy between them, which would be like a trine, but having a lightly synergistic relationship that's allowing for greater flow of give and take between those two energies in a person's life, as well as in terms of world events than there might be otherwise. So obviously, this is happening in the broader context of a lot of other crazy intense stuff, but at least it's nice indication that at least in some sectors, there's going to be some positive growth and expansion, because I think that's part of what you get when you take these two opposing forces and force them to work together in a way that's more flowing.
Yeah, or give them yeah, I would say um give them the opportunity to complement one another,
Mm,
right? Like you know, in if you are in one area of life experimenting with new things where you're not sure, the results cannot be guaranteed, but that can be anchored by being very by the book in another area of life where you're taking no risks and you know exactly what you're going to get, and vice versa. Where like little experimentation here, little by the book here, the two, excuse me, like the two can be very complementary rather than just going all in, like throwing all your chips in and hoping the experiment works with Uranus, or refusing to try anything new. And just kind of building a little prison for yourself with Saturn.
yeah, absolutely. And what's cool about it is like even though the aspect Saturn-Uranus goes exact early in the month on like the 4th or something, the aspect gets extended and it gets reactivated and triggered continuously through the second week of the month because of Mercury and Venus stationing in late Pisces on top of Saturn. So it's like they're activating Saturn and sextiling Uranus at the same time, which is just going to emphasize and intensify that sextile even more than it would be otherwise, because then it's getting inner planets to activate it instead of it just being these slow moving outer planets. So I think that's going to work together with the Venus stationing direct, and it's going to help many people to have a more positive forward moving motion with the Venus after Venus stations direct, and then there might be otherwise, because that Uranus energy is coming in and like offsetting the more inhibitive like Saturn energy that's hitting Venus.
Yeah, yeah, I see that.
Yeah,
It's
so that's some
it's
of the
it's not an easy set of problems to solve, but that's a nice angle and a real one.
yeah. All right. So that's kind of the first half of the month. After the first half of the month, we start moving into more tricky territory once we get into the middle and especially the end of the third week. So let me animate the chart so we can see where that is all taking us exactly. So there's April 12th when we have the full moon and we have Venus stationing direct. And then, right, so the sun starts very quickly moving into the square with Mars, but Mars switches signs and departs from Cancer and moves into Leo by April 18th. And this is going to be a huge vibe shift because we've been in Mars in Cancer land since what, like January? When did Mars go back into Cancer?
Yeah, it was very early January. That's when the second leg of Mars and Cancer began. Our first leg of Mars and Cancer was basically beginning of September to beginning of November. Then we got a break, and then beginning of January up until the middle of April. So it's been
Right.
the most Mars and Cancer you'll get for decades to come.
And it's like the first ingress of Mars into Leo was right before the presidential election, and then Trump was elected basically immediately after Mars moved into Leo, which is also his rising sign, as well as the rising sign of Vance, who became vice president at that time.
And the
So
the place where the sign where Trump has Mars, so the beginning of his Mars return, or sort of a false start to the beginning of his Mars return.
yeah, I mean, it's actually a lot of stuff for Trump. It's like
Yeah,
you're in it.
it should be.
Uranus starts off the month at like 24 Taurus, which is conjoining his midheaven at 24 Taurus. But by mid to late April, Uranus gets to 26 Taurus, which is squaring his Mars, which is at 26 Leo. Um, and that was, some of the challenging stuff that happened last summer was Uranus squaring his Mars in the first house, just because Mars in the first house natally can sometimes be tricky for bodily issues. And sometimes when that gets activated, you can have issues, come up at that time. So Uranus squaring his Mars and then Mars going back into his rising sign. Um, and let's talk about Mars and Leo,
Yeah,
though,
so
as
because that's
part of the
after the
vibe.
full moon, that's by far that's not only the next thing that's important, but it's a very important thing, right? So
Yeah,
it's on the 17th, Mars is finally done with Cancer, and Mars in Leo becomes very important for the rest of the month.
absolutely. So Mars in Leo, what do we have on that? Like I remember the Venus retrograde of 2023 in Leo, and there was like the Barbie movie and like that sort of feminine energy hitting some sort of peak, as well as like a focus on celebrities and celebrity relationships and breakups. And then I remember in November and December, I was commenting on how Mars slowing down and stationing retrograde in Leo seemed to be like this masculine energy suddenly coming in really loud at the end of the year. And some of it was like a sort of like toxic masculinity. Um, it's like a showy masculine energy, but
There's
also
a lot of oh, sorry, go ahead.
bravado. Yeah, that's a good term.
Yeah, the thing that I remember most about Mars and Leo just before the retrograde station was the massively promoted and watched and massively depressing bout between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson,
Okay.
which was a massive promotional success. You know, it's Mars, it's a fight. It was promoted tremendously successfully, and it left everybody wanting to never see anything like that again their entire lives. But
Yeah,
Mars,
I mean, I thought that was more of like a Saturn thing because it happened right on the Saturn station. I believe it was
yeah,
like the night of the Saturn station, and
it was
so it was.
it was also very Mars, and I predicted not here, but I predicted exactly what it would be based on the Mars. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
But
Well, I was going to
Mars,
mention that because this month when I did the research into Saturn Neptune conjunctions, it reminded me what I kept seeing is it reminded me of that station when the Tyson fight happened, but also when the Biden Trump debate happened on the first Saturn station in June, and all of a sudden, like Biden's age and cognitive struggles as a result of his advanced age suddenly became undeniable to everybody and eventually forced him to drop out. But when I was researching Saturn Neptune conjunctions this year or this month, I kept seeing a version of that, but with countries where there kept being a lot of like countries and dynasties that were like very old and kind of like swaying and decrepit or sick that would like collapse sometimes under those conjunctions of Saturn and Neptune.
yeah.
And I was surprised because like I kept seeing that and then I kept seeing like uprising of lower classes banding together and like doing uprisings and things like that. as another theme. And I was surprised by that. And that's something I wanted to mention here because that we shouldn't forget, even though it's not going exact this month, is we're heading very strongly into the Saturn-Neptune conjunction from this point forward.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you get those that sort of 3 month old Halloween pumpkin collapse, right? Where it
Right.
holds its structure until anything bumps into it, and the whole thing just turns to mush. Um,
Exactly.
but back to Mars and Leo, right? Just characterizing Mars and Leo. It's there's a lot of bravado. It's loud. As a one positive thing you see it, you can see it contributing to in people's natal charts is you see people who have a huge like showman streak. They have a bravery about getting up in front of people and doing their thing, right? Which can, if you don't have um, an artistic skill or something to show off, but you still have the courage to get up and dominate everybody's attention, um, can be really obnoxious. But like that's the quality. It's that bravery to get up in front of everybody, which if you have something worth saying or if you have something worth holding people's attention, it's wonderful that you have the bravery and the skill to get people's attention to do that. But that's not guaranteed with the Mars. The Mars just gives you the ability to get attention and the willingness and bravery to do that.
Right. So it's like the courage to be aggressively attention seeking, or sometimes, which can sometimes be a good thing. It can be somebody, like you're saying, that is a good showman, that has a sense for style or presentation. But then the downside can sometimes be like a ostentatiousness or a kind of like not being courageous, but being courageous or having big words for show, but
Mhm.
maybe not following through when it comes down to it, when it comes down to needing to actually take action and be brave.
Yeah, the negative side would be like people who are like an attention hog or a demagogue, right? Who are just like eating the attention. They're able to get the attention, but then they don't do anything good with it.
Yeah. So from a personal standpoint, one of the things that's interesting is that Mars, remember, Mars stationed retrograde at 6 degrees of Leo in December. So it's still retracing its steps, but it finishes retracing its steps by May 1st. So we finally leave the post-retrograde shadow period at the very end of this month. But as a result of that, in the last week and a half of April, it's going to be directly taking us back to some events that happened from the beginning of November through December as Mars returns back to, for a final time, those same exact degrees in the first 6 degrees of Leo.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because not only do we have Mars finishing up those same degrees that constitute its retrograde path, but we also have the finale of the three oppositions with Pluto because those are the three, or excuse me, those are the two things that really define this Mars retrograde is what degrees did it cross and the three oppositions with Pluto. So we get both of those. And it's worth noting that very shortly after Mars's return to Leo, not only do we have the opposition with Pluto forming, but the Sun then ingresses into Taurus on the 20th. And then we have a really tense configuration, a T square, where the Sun and Mars are square and the Sun and Pluto are square, while Mars and Pluto are opposing each other. And so that last opposition between Mars and Pluto also draws the Sun into it, which is going to further intensify and complicate it. And so it makes like we could say 20th through the 24th, 23rd, however you want to phrase it, but a lot of the end of the month, like really tense. And when we were
Yeah,
character,
it kind of culminates on the second lunation because what I noticed was that new moon that happens, it happens at 7 degrees of Taurus on the 27th, and this is just after the Mars-Pluto opposition has gone exact. So the lunation is like squaring the Mars-Pluto opposition in early Leo and Aquarius. –
yeah, it's certainly, I don't think it's going to feel over till the end of the month.
Right.
The yeah, and yeah, there's some other, the moon's conjunction with Pluto on the 20th, which is an opposition with Mars and a square with the moon, would I would say bring us into this Mars Pluto Sun thing that we're going to do for a lot of the rest of the month,
Right.
that gets re-emphasized several times. And so when we are talking about Mars Pluto before, we're talking about some of the shapes that it takes in news headlines and big events, right? But I'd like to add to that that on a personal level with the Mars Pluto, a lot of times it if there are any funny power dynamics in your life, it'll make those really itchy. Where one, if there are any real ones, attention gets drawn to those. Those become sort of heated up, and then even if there aren't, people get really touchy around power and power dynamics with Mars Pluto oppositions. Mars Pluto in general, but oppositions most definitely. And again, the things turn in that direction to either imagine crazy power dynamics, to create crazy power dynamics, or to look directly at real crazy power dynamics. But that's a very consistent thing that that transit creates.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that was what was actually really striking about the first exact opposition is like the second one at the beginning of January was really overt stuff. Like explosions were happening, like people were driving into crowds of people in cars, fires were happening. But the first opposition was actually much more subtle, which happened right before the election. And one of the news stories that happened like right on that opposition or very close to it that I noted at the time was when Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post several years ago, the Washington Post editorial team was getting ready to issue an endorsement for the presidential election, as they've done for many decades now, and they were about to endorse Kamala Harris. And then all of a sudden, at the last minute, Bezos stepped in and said, "No, we're not doing any endorsements anymore." And there was this really bold but sort of behind the scenes power play thing that was happening where you could see a little bit of the peak of it in terms of the like the iceberg above the ocean, but you could
Mhm.
kind of tell and infer that there was a bunch of stuff happening under the ocean at the same time in terms of the type of backroom deals and power plays and pressure that was happening. And that, of course, which we noted I remember remarking on that
Yeah,
at the
we talk.
time, we remarked on it, but then of course that then culminates and becomes even more clear and more obvious later on inauguration day when it's like Bezos and this other line of billionaires suddenly is there at the inauguration, standing behind Trump as he's inaugurated in this really visible way, just in terms of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
subsequent discussions about oligarchy and things like that.
Yeah, when the sun was directly on Pluto, so we could see the invisible for a second. Yeah, and we
Right.
talked about how, in retrospect, the Mars Pluto oppositions, the two that we'd seen up to that point, really seemed to time very nicely, like the shifting political allegiances of the oligarch class, or tech oligarch, mostly, that we
Right.
didn't see as clearly on the way in, but seemed pretty clear. And so some events of that nature that like speak to that and maybe complete a shift or speak to the completion of those shifting alliances seem very likely with
Right.
this last go through, and especially because the sun is watching during this one. The sun is square both. So we have that. The sun brings visibility as well as questions of leadership and authority. But it's,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
There's
but I don't,
also
oh, please, sorry.
this month there was some stuff with Pluto, and I can't remember what it was, but there were some stories that made it really clear, and it reminded me of the underworld and sometimes like criminal associations with Pluto, as well as sometimes the attempts to hide or suppress criminal activity that sometimes comes along with Pluto. And that might be relevant. Like there, oh yeah, that's what it was. Lisa Scheim pointed out to me there was this story that it was like an expose that was done by I'm blanking out on his name, Ronan Farrow, who has a Mars-Pluto conjunction in the 10th
Oh,
house, ruling his third house.
interesting.
And he did this expose about this story that was being buried by this local police department that were covering up for these like terrible, terrible crimes that were happening. And a prosecutor was like fired in order to like cover it up. And eventually the prosecutor, out of desperation, sent this story to Ronan Farrow, and he ended up doing an expose and blowing it wide open, which finally eventually led to charges being pressed about against this guy who's doing these terrible crimes as well as those who are covering up. So I just mentioned that because I had forgotten, and it was a good reminder of some of the underworldly type things that sometimes come up with Pluto and Pluto aspects. But there's
Yeah,
also the ability to investigate and to sometimes expose those things at the same time.
yeah, it's both the things that are kept hidden as well as the draw to ferret out those things that have been kept hidden. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because they with Pluto, like those things which are kept hidden will be sort of metaphorically down, right? Like you'll under hidden underneath, right? Like with like the underworld of criminal organizations, but then you also have the underworld above you, right? Like the people whose wealth is 10,000 times that of yours, right? Like who live in a different world that is also completely opaque to you, right? Like the billionaire class or the oligarch class, like they live in an underworld above you, right? And so that the underworld kind of begins whenever you get far away enough from here on Earth, and Pluto speaks to both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I forgot to show this graphic. So here's our classic Mars retrograde graphic. I'm having trouble finding the one that has Pluto as well. Maybe I can splice it in post, but it just shows the journey that we've been through with this Mars retrograde in Cancer and Leo at this point, and how yeah, April is really about moving into the final phases of that, especially when it goes into Leo on April 17th, and then it will exit its post-retrograde shadow at 6 Leo on May 1st or 2nd, and then eventually Mars will depart from Leo on June 17th, ending the cycle completely. But we are finally getting to the final phases of that. But with some of these third and final aspects, there may still be some major, like the most notable events basically may still be coming rather than being in the past.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, even though it's a little, how should I say, it's not exactly a bunch of stuff to look forward to, I'm still looking forward to just getting done with this cycle. Like
Right.
this is gonna have, we need to like do the third and final pass. Mars needs to do these degrees in Leo. Let's see what it is, and then move on to what's next, or deal with what happens.
Yeah.
One of the disadvantages of being able to see the shape of things reasonably well with astrology is that sometimes it becomes a little bit of a sword dangling over your head. It's like, oh, yeah, but April 20th through 24th, like that's going to happen. And so contradictorily, it's sort of nice to get it out of the way sometimes. Because so
Yeah.
far, none of it is ever the end of the world, no matter how unpleasant it is. And so we're getting it out of the way during the second half of the month. I'm really trying to be positive this month, Chris. Have you noticed?
I
You
I know
appreciate it?
you are a ray of sunshine in my otherwise cloudy perspective right now. I am deeply myself over Mars and Cancer, and I'm ready to be done with it. There was some slight, highlights of it, like the Kendrick Lamar thing and his rise to prominence, especially with the Super Bowl, was pretty cool. But no offense to the Mars and Cancer people, but I feel like people with Cancer placements in general are probably over this transit at this point for the most part as well. It's probably not just me.
Yeah. Oh, me and my Cancer rising can't wait.
Right.
I'm
It
yeah,
it's been
I'm even done with being done with it.
Yeah, it's been a good run. Well,
Great.
good news is we'll be done with Mars retrograde in Cancer for a while. Not great news. This Mars retrograde in Leo, we've got another one of those that comes up again in like a couple years because this cycle has a back-to-back repetition this particular one that goes back to back every 2 years, at roughly every like 15 to 17 years or something like that. So we actually have to pay even closer attention to the closing down of this Mars retrograde and Leo cycle over the next 2 months between now and June, because Mars is going to come back and retrograde again in Leo and Virgo, I think in 2027.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so that's going to be relevant for, so for example, anybody that has like Leo rising, whatever's going on in this retrograde cycle may be relevant again in 2 years' time when Mars does that again.
Yep. But your Cancer planets are not
Are
only will they
safe.
not have to do this again for a very, very, very long time, but you'll get Jupiter coming to Cancer soon enough in just a couple months to soothe what has been irritated.
Yeah, to put some aloe on the burns. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that Jupiter and Cancer for those Jupiter and for those Cancer placements. All right, my friend, let me look at the calendar. Is there anything else we need to mention about the later part of the month or the end of the month as we're wrapping up here?
Yeah,
Any,
it's not an you mentioned it earlier, but I think we should spend just a little bit of time on the lunation that comes at the very, very close to the end of the month on the 27th. We get the new moon in Taurus, which is still close enough. It's past the Mars-Pluto opposition, and the Mars-Pluto opposition is just starting to weaken. But it's close enough that the Mars Pluto opposition events and outcomes are going to are how should we say squarely within the view of both the sun and the moon. And so that the resetting for the next cycle, which the new moon is, still beholds that opposition quite clearly, even though it's starting, it's starting to be over, and Mars is almost out of those degrees, are out
mm,
of the degrees of its retrograde. And so we're trying to like restart in Taurus and like how to, do Taurian things, be practical, stabilize things, figure out how to make things sustainable. But we have to take into account the Mars Pluto and what what ill it has wrought in our plans to do so.
yeah, and start to pick up the pieces as it moves away. It's funny how much I've been reminded over the past month or so, how much as soon as an aspect gets a degree separating, like you really do start to see this drop off like pretty dramatically in the intensity of the energy. So it is nice that Mars is not quite there yet by the time of the new moon. It's still actually within a degree, but within a few days of that, it does separate by a degree or more by the end of April, and it starts to recede somewhat.
Yeah, yeah. And so by the last day of April, we really are able to start looking back on this Mars cycle, right? Like it has just entered the whole thing has just entered the rear view mirror. And that's maybe
Definitely
an
by the first few days of May for sure, when it leaves its
yeah.
shadow.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's fair. And so, it's interesting, April is really the not only is it the final outcomes of the whole Mars cycle, but we also do the entirety of the eclipse season. We don't have the very last, like Venus still has a little bit of, still has some shadow left to cover by the end of April, but Venus has covered the majority of that retrograde. Mercury has made it back out of its retrograde shadow by the end of April. And so April's like working through all of this stuff that didn't begin in April, but we're done with almost all of it and ready, readying to move into what things are now that those cycles have taken place.
That's great. That's perfect. You're right. Yeah, because we're coming off of the retrograde. April really is us trying to come off of the retrograde cycles of all three of those inner planets of Mercury, of Venus, and Mars. And then after April, like we'll actually start really treading new ground and moving forward again into uncharted territory. But there's still something about unfinished business that we're still wrapping up in April.
Yeah, yeah. There's a I mean, and that's maybe the right phrase, right? Is that April's just full of getting through all of the unfinished business because there's so much unfinished business.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So for different people's personal lives, all of that will harken back to whatever was happening in your personal life when those planets first traced those degrees, whether it's like Mars in November through December, tracing those early degrees of Leo, whether it's like Venus, which is going through Pisces starting in January, February, and then it returns to Aries at the very end of the month, or Mercury, which when did Mercury hit these degrees? I guess just in the month preceding, mainly in March,
Yeah, it was in February and then, or maybe it was early March, late
late
February when,
February, early March. Yeah. Okay. Late February, early March. That makes sense. Yeah. So bringing those things to a close, coming full circle, and yeah, finishing things that you thought were over and done for, but you find that you have to return back to one last time before you can make the final push to move forward.
yeah, and getting done with these big resets, right? Like Mars, Mars is retrograde. It's a big reset, but completing it, you don't have to do another one for another 2 years, right? Venus is retrograde. It's a big reset. Completing it, not going to have to do another one for a year and a half. Mercury, different thing, but like that's two reasonable resets. And so what you get out of those is, how you're going to do things and approach things and being oriented to the next year plus, so that you're oriented and ready to address reality as it is now, rather than before things needed to change.
Yeah. I saw like at least two or three different people just change their hairstyle during this Venus retrograde, which I thought was so funny and like classic. Did you change your hairstyle? Is that what you were doing that motion?
Oh, I was thinking about it. I was, yeah, I don't know if, I know Lucian really likes grabbing my hair,
Right.
um, giving me, clown hair. I'd love to just cut all my hair off. I kind of hate having hair. But I look menacing.
When your
So
head is shaved.
yeah, it's not a good look for me.
Yeah. One of them was funny. Um, what is her name? Emily. There's a famous supermodel who got like a bad haircut last week, and people were telling her about Venus retrograde, and she was saying that she was like an astrology believer now. But I think there's something about the boldness to try to completely redo your style that you sometimes feel empowered to attempt during a Venus retrograde. That while sometimes it may not go super smooth or be as good as you hoped, the attempt to like shake up the things that you're used to that you've been doing for so long, that doing a redesign or a makeover represents such a major move. I think sometimes just the process of shaking things up in your life is sometimes worth it, even if it doesn't go super smooth. And I was kind of taking that a little lesson from that as observing that in other people recently.
That's nice. Yeah. Sometimes the, what should we say, the internal part of you is ready to make the change, but the external circumstances haven't quite aligned.
Yeah, exactly. But
But yeah,
sometimes changing things is like pushing over like a refrigerator and you got to rock it back and forth a few times before you get enough motion to truly change your life. Sometimes it starts with like little steps.
that's a nice image.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. Anything else we meant to mention about that? We got a lot to mention in May when Saturn goes into Aries. That's going to truly be like Saturn Neptune coming in full force and full blast at that point. I feel like we're going to be talking about that aspect a lot, and it's actually going to be more interesting than before I researched it this month. I really felt like it was going to be because so much of what it's been for the past 2 years is it's been building up has just been like what's real versus what's not real, the boundary between them getting blurred, and facts and other things like that suddenly becoming much more unclear. But there's going to be a lot more interesting stuff with this when we get into it next month in May, when Saturn changes signs and goes into Aries, both due to the vibe shift of what Saturn and Aries is going to be like in general, but also because it immediately then like meets up with Neptune there.
Yeah. And in a small act of kindness, the planets have decided to not put that at the beginning of May, right after we finally get done with the other shit.
That's right.
It waits for us at the end of May. So we've got all of this business, which we finish up in April and then early May. And there's a few weeks before something else major changes. Saturn moves on the 24th. Again,
Yeah.
it's not kindness, but it's a very small. If it's kindness, it's very small. It's at least not cruelty, which the heavens are abundantly capable of.
Yeah. Well, I called it in our year ahead forecast. I called it the year that everything changed or the year that everything changes. And that has certainly been the case and has worked out well. And you also had a good phrase, which is the clown apocalypse,
Oh,
which
well,
also came true.
it was the cyberpunk clown apocalypse.
Okay. Well, that's good too. That's also
The
good.
tech element is very important. Yeah, I had a couple different things. None of them. That one was at least the funniest. But
Right.
yeah, it's the lip. How about the edge of the abyss? I mean, it's enter. We have now entered what's basically an 8 years that rearranges everything all over the world. Um, it's yeah the yeah that's that. I'm going to be positive, Austin, and not elaborate on the finally falling over the edge of the cliff, which will take 8 years to hit bottom.
All
That's
right.
not
Well,
the image.
I appreciate this new role reversal that we've had
Hmm.
in this Venus retrograde where you're the positive one and I'm the like not super optimistic one, but it's good. It's good. I like the balance of that.
Yeah, it's positive, Austin. The Venus is,
Absolutely.
the Venus went over all my stuff. It's really important. I had some revelations, and I promise to be a force for optimism on the podcast every month moving forward.
Okay. I'm gonna hold you to that. All right, my friend. What do you got coming up this month? What are you working on? Like you got things in the works? Are there things that you're doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, there's a fair amount going on. So one, I don't even want to mention it. Working on the book that I wrote 10 years ago, working towards the second edition. And then I'm also going to be doing an intake for my year one of the Fundamentals of Astrology program. I think we're probably going to do the intake on the 17th. I might mess with that. It's hard to find an election I like in April. But if you haven't joined my mailing list, please do. That's where the invitations to join the program go out, and I'll be sending out an update once Mercury is direct and I am no longer like wiffle wobbling about which day to open it up. But yeah, open seats in the program. And then Sphere and Sundry has a bunch of things going on. A bunch of classic series are coming back. They've been coming back throughout March, and then a bunch of old favorites will be available again for the first time in a while throughout April. I believe the schedule is about one per week. There's also a new series which is going to be available tomorrow, which I did, which is um, let's see, it's it's a Mars and Capricorn series, and it uses an iron palm herbal formula in combination with a mansion election in combination with Mars in Capricorn. It's really interesting. It's a fun little project. It's sort of Ficino meets Kung Fu. Check out the write up. It'll be out tomorrow. And then finally, of the previously created things, which are available again in this case for a limited amount of time. The Thema Mundi series is on sale again. And it's worth noting that that was seven separate operations that were then unified by Kate doing a week-long hermitage where she didn't see the outside world. I didn't see her. And the results of that eight workings as one are literally magical, but pretty extraordinary project. So all of that, a lot going on with Sphere and Sundry. If you'd like to join my astrological education program, we're doing an opening, and I will be otherwise hiding and trying to write.
Nice. Awesome. I support that. What are your websites?
So it's Austin Coppock, my name.com, and sphere andsundry.com.
Nice. I love that. You're like literally magical, not metaphorically magical. It's not a metaphor.
Yeah, it's also a metaphor, but the metaphor is not the important part.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Cool. All right. As for myself, I'm going to just continue working on the podcast this month. I've got a lot of good, big stuff coming up. Since the Venus retrograde cycle is winding down, I think I'm going to do some Venus retrograde episodes. I kind of want to interview patrons to do some interviews to hear about how the Venus retrograde and the eclipses went in people's lives. So
Hmm.
I'm thinking about doing a live stream with patrons on that maybe next weekend. Working on another Venus retrograde episode on queer history for this Venus retrograde, which it turns out to be very closely tied into. It should be a really good episode.
That makes sense.
And I've been collecting news stories from like Venus retrograde for a follow-up Venus retrograde in the news episode as well. So I may do one of those. I'm also going to be working on the fifth house episode in the background. I don't know yet if I'm going to commit to it. Like the last 3 months, I've done like huge research episodes every month, and
Yeah,
it's taken a lot out of me, even though it's been really worth it, especially that Saturn Neptune conjunction episode. But I'm going to decide sometime around the middle of the month whether I'm going to tackle another big episode and do the fifth house and resume that series, or whether I'm going to just keep researching it, but maybe record it early the following month. I'll see how things are going and feel that out. But there should be some good episodes this month, and I'm going to give people early access to those episodes through my page on patreon.com. So if you want to get access or even join me for some of the live recordings and interviews like that Venus retrograde live stream, then you can sign up there. All right. I think that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining me, Austin. This is a lot. We had a lot to cover today, but as always, it was amazing doing this with you and being on this journey with you. So thanks for doing it with me.
yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time.
All right, take care.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly electional astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alibarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, and Berlin West. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software Astro Gold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening May 22nd through the 26th, 2025. Their in-person conference is sold out, but you can still register to get a virtual ticket where they're going to stream the conference simultaneously online in May, and you can register for that now through their website at norwac.net.